Have you ever wondered what it truly takes to snatch a throne from someone who's supposed to be your partner? What if the quiet girl in the background was secretly the most dangerous player of all? Tonight, we're unraveling the story of how one woman turned the game of power upside down and became the queen of a kingdom that was never meant to be hers. Forget what you think you know about kingdoms and crowns. Because we're not just talking about gold and jewels, we're talking about secret plots, icy bedrooms, and a mind sharper than any blade. So, lean back, grab something warm to drink, and let me introduce you to Katrina the Unrelenting, the cunning princess from the rugged hills of Velsberg, who rewrote the destiny of an empire. She was born as Liesel Katrina von Reichen on a rainy morning in May of 1730, far away from any bustling city. Her family, the von Reichens, were no powerful rulers, just minor nobles tucked away in the quiet forests of the Western Duchy. They had a respectable name, but not much to show for it. Her father, a stern captain in the local garrison, spent more time cleaning his boots than worrying about his children's dreams. Her mother, though, was cut from sharper cloth, a woman who believed that clever marriages were the secret doors to power. Liesel, even as a child, could see the glint of ambition in her mother's eyes, and she soaked it in like a sponge. No one thought Liesel was destined for a crown. She was just a clever girl in a small house, learning to balance a teacup with perfect posture. But even then, she was different. She listened to the court gossip like it was a secret treasure map, memorizing who was in favor and who was about to be cast aside. She read every dusty book in her father's tiny library, from ancient legends to political treatises, and taught herself how to smile with perfect grace while plotting her next move. When she was 14, everything changed in a single letter. Word came from the grand palace of Nordheim, a glittering city far away, where towers touched the clouds and secrets flowed like wine. Queen Isolde of Nordheim, childless and desperate for a fresh line to carry the crown, had chosen a successor, her nephew, Leopold of Holzenberg, another foreign-born noble with more fancy titles than real power. But Leopold was in need of a bride, and Queen Isolde had set her sights on Liesel. Overnight, the quiet life of the von Reichens was turned upside down. Gone were the damp forests of Velsberg. In their place loomed the endless marble halls of Nordheim. The journey was long and bone-cold. Liesel traveled by carriage through twisting mountain passes, her face pressed to the window as snow blanketed the world outside. She arrived at the royal palace as an out-Siderno Nordheimer blood in her veins, no fancy Orthodox prayers on her lips. But she was determined. She didn't waste a moment in self-pity. She changed her name to Katrina Althea, learned the local tongue with tireless zeal, and practiced court etiquette until she could outshine the most polished noble. She charmed the stoic Nordheimers with her quick wit and borrowed their prayers until she could recite them better than Leopold himself. Her mother scolded her for being too serious, too lost in thought. The palace gossipers called her the silent fox, always watching but never speaking. But Katrina had no intention of simply surviving. She intended to thrive. And she had already seen something that made her decision as clear as ice. Her betrothed, Leopold, was a man trapped in a boy's mind. Leopold was a puzzle she solved within days. He was obsessed with his collection of miniature knights, playing endless battles on the dining table while ignoring the real world beyond his gilded window. He mumbled through council meetings, more concerned with who had the prettiest horse than who had the most pressing political petition. Katrina saw it all, and she made a silent vow that would shape her fate. If Leopold could be heir to the throne, then she could be the one to truly rule it. Their wedding was a grand affair, all silver trumpets and whispered vows, but behind every smile was a dagger. Katrina knew she was a guest in someone else's story, and that she'd have to write her own lines. The grand ballrooms were filled with laughter, but she was already taking notes on who toasted too eagerly and who lingered by the shadows. The marriage itself was a disappointment, a cold, careful arrangement that had no warmth to it. Leopold spent more time polishing his toy soldiers than speaking to his new bride, and he never looked her in the eye when they spoke of state affairs. In private, he was awkward and hesitant, the kind of man who flinched at the weight of responsibility. But Katrina was not one to let disappointment slow her down. She played her part to perfection, graceful at feasts, attentive in council, never showing the simmering frustration beneath her calm exterior. She taught herself to dance through the political minefields with a smile. She read everything she could, get her hands on histories of conquest, radical philosophies that promised a brighter future, treatises on power and the art of persuasion. In her chambers, she wrote late into the night, her journals filling with observations and half-formed plans. Katrina began to dream of a different Nordheimon, where rulers were not puppets, but visionaries. She believed a queen could be both kind and fierce, using her power not for petty cruelty, but to rebuild the kingdom in her image. She read the words of philosophers who spoke of liberty and progress, their fiery ideas feeding the fire within her. While others at court obsessed over jewels and gossip, Katrina was already plotting her revolution quietly, carefully, and with a determination that burned brighter than any candle. Of course, Nordheim was no fairy tale. The palace was a maze of secrets and schemes, where betrayal hid behind every door. Katrina learned to trust no one completely. Spies whispered in the night, and alliances shifted faster than the moon. Even her health was tested. One winter, she fell gravely ill, and rumors spread that Leopold resented her so deeply that he denied her the medicine she needed. She survived, but the memory of that cold betrayal never left her. It became a warning. In this world, weakness was fatal. And so Katrina began to build her own quiet army, not of soldiers, but of allies. She befriended a few key nobles who shared her dreams of change, men and women who had grown weary of Leopold's childish games. She shared secret conversations with military officers who longed for a leader who could match their discipline. Even her personal physician became a trusted confidant, a man who knew how to heal the body and how to whisper words of caution in her ear. When her marriage to Leopold turned as cold as the palace gardens in winter, Katrina found solace in the arms of others. Lovers came and went like passing seasons. Some gave her comfort. Others gave her the information she needed to further her plans. She learned that sometimes the softest whispers in the dark could be the strongest weapons in the light. The court was thick with rumors, and Katrina learned to smile at them all. She became a master of the quiet game, knowing when to speak and when to stay silent. She would slip away from the endless banquets to pore over maps and letters by candlelight. She studied the faces of those around her like a chessboard, learning which pieces to move and which to sacrifice. Every compliment she paid was a calculated move. Every cold glance was a test of loyalty. It was in this cold, glittering world that Katrina grew from a quiet bride into something far more formidable, a queen in waiting, armed not with swords, but with secrets. She had come to Nordheim as a guest, but she would leave her mark on its throne forever. Her quiet determination was like a blade hidden in silk, and everyone who underestimated her would learn the same hard lesson. Never mistake a silent fox for a harmless one. So, take a moment to like this tale if it's caught your attention, and let us know where you're listening from tonight, because this is just the beginning of Katrina's story. The games of power have only begun, and the most dangerous pieces are still waiting to be played. Get comfortable, because Katrina's saga is one of shadows, laughter, betrayal, and triumph. And we're only just opening the first chapter. For a while, Katrina lived her life in quiet corners, watching, learning, and building alliances under the cover of night. She had lovers, yes, but their purpose was never simple passion. With them came secrets, leverage, and protection against the shifting tides of the royal court. Love was a pleasant diversion, but it was never her endgame. What Katrina truly wanted was power she could wield with her own hands. Leopold, her husband, was still the legitimate heir to the throne, but Katrina was done being a shadow in his life, a figurehead to complement his empty crown. She'd tasted the dangerous thrill of court politics, the delight of reading radical texts in secret, and the rush of ambition's heat. She wasn't content to be an empress in name only. She was determined to become empress by sheer force of will. When Queen Isolde finally breathed her last, In the spring of 1762, Leopold rose to the throne as King Leopold III of Nordheim. Katrina, now in her early 30s, had spent more than a decade waiting, plotting, and reading the world's most subversive ideas. But her husband had not grown up in that time. He was still the same bumbling boy she'd married, restless, unpopular, and prone to reckless decisions that would scandalize the kingdom. Within mere months, Leopold managed to alienate the entire court. He offended the devout clergy of the Nordheimian temple with careless insults. He withdrew soldiers from a hard-won border war, angering the generals and abandoning old alliances. His bizarre loyalty to Frederick of Westphalia, an old rival of the Nordheimers, left the nobles disgusted. The military began to see him as a traitor. The priests saw him as a heretic. And Katrina, she watched it all unfold with cold focus, her mind calculating every consequence. By now, Katrina had already begun to weave her web of influence in secret. She had the ear of key nobles, like the gallant Captain Nicholas Oswin, a striking officer who was not only her lover but also her trusted conduit to the palace guard. Nicholas was no mere distraction. He was the key that could unlock the throne itself. Together, they whispered plans in moonlit halls, trading dreams of a Nordheim reshaped by Katrina's iron will. She had no official right to the crown, no legal document to claim the throne. But she possessed something far stronger than any royal decree: the loyalty of those who held the swords, the soldiers whose allegiance would decide the fate of the kingdom. Then, on a dawn-drenched morning, June 28, 1762, Katrina struck. With Leopold distracted by his latest childish amusements, Katrina rode to the barracks of the famed Iron Wolves Regiment. Dressed in gleaming regalia, she stood tall before the battle-hardened soldiers, her voice as calm as the river in winter. "I am your sovereign," she declared, her words clear as a church bell tolling midnight. "Swear your loyalty, not to a fool who would see Nordheim fall, but to me, a ruler who will stand for you." The soldiers didn't hesitate. They saluted her on the spot, their swords raised in silent oath. Words spread like wildfire. One by one, the nobles, the merchants, and even the wary priests fell in line behind Katrina. She rode through the cobbled streets of Nordheim's capital, her bearing regal and unbreakable, while the people watched with a strange mix of awe and relief. There was no riot in the alleys that day, no bitter uprising to challenge her. The kingdom, it seemed, was waiting for her all along. Leopold fled the palace in the dead of night, driven out by a tide he had never understood. Within days, he was forced to renounce his throne. His fate was sealed soon after. Officially, no one spoke of what happened in the shadowed chamber where he met his end. Nicholas was there, as were a handful of Katrina's most trusted allies. Whether she gave the order herself, no one could prove. She simply said later, with a serene smile, he was no longer needed. In the end, it was a coup executed so cleanly it felt almost like a dance. No blood in the streets, no civil war, just a perfect handover from a failed king to a queen who had waited too long to be denied. Now, Katrina was no longer a pretender. She was the undisputed queen of Nordheim, yet winning the crown was just the opening act. The real battle lay in proving she was worthy of the throne she had claimed. Katrina understood what most rulers never did. That power wasn't only about armies or bloodlines. Power was also about image, about how the world saw her. So, she wasted no time. She took her stolen kingdom and set about reimagining herself. She styled herself not as a conqueror, but as a visionary sovereign with a mind for progress and an appetite for ideas. She invited scholars to her court, men and women who burned with the fire of new philosophies. She wrote letters to the great thinkers of Europe, Voltaire, Derrida, and beyond, sharing ideas, debating questions of justice, reason, and the future of humankind. To these philosophers, Katrina wasn't just another queen wrapped in silks and jewels. She was a living testament to the power of thought, a ruler who could quote their words and breathe them into law. She sent money to fund their studies, praising liberty and the promise of knowledge. She spoke of education, of a kingdom lifted out of ignorance and superstition. Yet for all her talk of reason, Katrina never forgot that in Nordheim the old ways still held sway. Nordheim was a land built on ancient customs and rigid class divides. The nobles owned vast estates, their wealth measured in the lives of those who worked their fields. The peasants were little more than indentured laborers, bound by law to the soil. Katrina wanted to change this. She dreamed of a fairer kingdom, a place where justice was not just for the powerful, and where every soul could rise by merit alone. In 1767, she gathered a grand commission lawyers, judges, even a few daring radicals to draft a new legal code. Katrina herself penned the heart of it, the Edict of Enlightenment, a bold declaration that called for the end of torture, the rise of education, and the equality of all before the law. European intellectuals hailed it as a spark of brilliance, the work of a queen with the mind of a philosopher. But dreams don't always survive the light of day. In Nordheim's grand council halls, the nobles bristled at the idea of giving up their ancient privileges. The clergy saw Katrina's reforms as an affront to the divine order they guarded so jealously. And Katrina, no fool, understood that pushing too far too fast would not only end her regnate, might plunge the kingdom into civil war. She retreated from some of her grandest plans, setting them aside like a chess player who sees the trap too late, but she never abandoned them completely. In the privacy of her candlelit study, Katrina continued to write, to dream, to plot the day when Nordheim would be ready for the changes she still held in her heart. So, what do you think of Katrina the Unrelenting? Let us know where you're listening from tonight, because this tale is far from over. The throne she claimed was only the beginning. The real test of her reign was about to begin, and Katrina had no intention of failing. Stay with us, because the next chapter promises even more secrets, betrayals, and the unstoppable will of a queen who refused to be just another footnote in history. Picture this. A queen who dreamed of rewriting the story of her kingdom, balancing ideals with raw ambition in a world that was always ready to tear her down. Katrina the Unrelenting was no mere figurehead, she was the architect of a quiet revolution. And while her grand plans to reshape Nordheim's laws faced stubborn resistance, some of her dreams took root like wildflowers in cracked stone. Education was her chosen battlefield. Katrina believed the mind was a kingdom of its own, and she wanted to open its gates for everyone, especially the women who had always been told their voices didn't matter. She established the Liechtenstein Institute for Young Ladies, the first state-funded academy for noble-born girls in Nordheim. There, girls who would have been taught nothing but embroidery learned poetry, philosophy, and even the sciences. Katrina poured silver and gold into the arts, too. She opened grand theaters where actors spoke lines that challenged the soul. She turned the palace's dusty old library into a beacon of learning and built museums that sang with the colors of ancient tapestries and modern visionaries. Under her reign, Nordheim's capital, Altenburg, blossomed into a place of elegance and curiosity, a city that hummed with debate and discovery. But for all her enlightened dreams, Katrina understood the dance she had to perform. She balanced on a knife's edge, keeping the nobles loyal with flattery and favor, the commoners quiet with gentle reforms, and the foreign thinkers charmed with letters of flattery and wit. Every step she took was measured, every word weighed with care. Katrina spoke of liberty as though it were a lover's name, but behind every gracious nod was a mind that understood the ruthless nature of power. And no matter how many schools she built or plays she funded, she could never escape the endless fascination people had with her private life. In the candle-lit salons of Altenburg, rumors about her lovers spread like wildfire. Her first great romance after seizing the throne was with Nicholas Oswin, the dashing officer who had been both her protector and her co-conspirator. He was more than a lover, he was her partner in political chess, the man who had helped her steal the crown she wore so regally. But time is the great devourer of all things, and their bond grew strained. Nicholas became erratic, consumed by his own restless ambition, and Katrina, the realist, began to turn her eyes elsewhere. What followed was a careful waltz of passion and strategy. Katrina's affairs were never reckless. They were precise, deliberate choices, each man selected for what he could bring to her kingdom. Some were brilliant scholars, others were fierce generals, and one among them would become the most significant of all, Gregor Polkin. Gregor was no mere courtly dalliance. He was a man of fervor and vision, a strategist whose mind burned as brightly as Katrina's own. Their affair blazed with an intensity that left the court breathless and scandalized. But though the heat of romance cooled in time, their political alliance only grew stronger. Gregor became her partner in empire building. Together, they expanded Nordheim's borders, secured fragile alliances, and reimagined the kingdom's place in the wider world. There were whispers they had even married in secret, but no priest or parchment ever confirmed it. Regardless of titles, they remained bound by a shared mission that no petty scandal could shake. Even after they stopped sharing a bed, they never stopped sharing ideas. Their letters warm, teasing, and clever spoke of admiration that outlasted any fleeting passion. But the court was never silent. Foreign envoys reported breathlessly on the queen's rotating list of consorts. Broadsheets in distant cities painted Katrina as a temptress and a tyrant. One outlandish, rumor-pure slander claimed she had died in the arms of a beast, an accusation as grotesque as it was false. It was nothing more than the old world's fury at a woman who ruled with both mind and body, a queen who would not shrink to fit their narrow expectations. Katrina never wasted breath denying these rumors. She didn't need to. Her rule was her answer, and it thundered louder than any malicious pamphlet. She was the queen who had taken the crown by daring, who held it by brilliance, and who wielded it with unwavering resolve. Yes, she loved passionately, but never without purpose. In her world, love was another battlefield known where loyalty could be tested, alliances forged, and the currency of affection spent with careful calculation. Katrina spoke the language of progress to the philosophers who wrote her name in glowing terms, but she never forgot that beneath every elegant speech, power was the final word. She knew what it meant to risk everything for a throne and what it cost to keep it. In the winter of 1773, just over a decade into her reign, the kingdom she had so carefully reshaped was shaken to its core. A man named Elias Yarkov emerged from the shadowy reaches of the north, a Cossack and a deserter who claimed to be none other than Leopold the husband Katrina, had long since buried in both fact and memory. Elias's lie was a spark that found eager fuel in the simmering discontent of the peasants. He promised land to the poor, freedom to the oppressed, and justice to those who had known only backbreaking labor. He painted Katrina as a usurper, a tyrant who had stolen not only a throne but the people's birthright. The rebellion spread like wildfire through the frozen countryside. Farmers and herdsmen rose up, pitchforks in hand and fire in their hearts. They remembered every tax collector who had squeezed them for coin and every noble who had taken their sweat for granted. Yarkov's lie was powerful because it was wrapped in the hope of a better world, one where Katrina's shining city of learning was nothing but a distant dream. Katrina, rattled but never cowed, responded as only she could. She did not shrink from the fight. She called upon her loyal generals, the same ones she had charmed and commanded for years. She wrote orders in her firm, deliberate hand, every word a shield against the chaos she would not allow to consume her kingdom. There would be no mercy for traitors, no room for rebellion in the new Nordheim she had built. For Katrina knew what too many forget, that in the end, a throne is never truly safe. It must be defended not just with ideas, but with iron and blood if need be. So while her court gossiped about love and whispered about scandal, Katrina gathered her armies, ready to silence the lie that threatened everything she had fought to claim. And that, dear listener, is where we leave Katrina for tonight at the edge of a kingdom in flames, with a crown still firmly on her head and a mind as sharp as ever. Let us know where you're listening from and whether you're brave enough to see what Katrina will do next. Because if there's one thing her story has taught us, it's that a queen like her never surrenders without a fight. Imagine a kingdom where the fires of rebellion burned bright enough to turn villages to ash. In the final days of winter, the kingdom of Nordheim learned just how fragile the piece of a crown could be. Katrina, the unrelenting, watched her empire crack and quake under the weight of lies and fury, and she met that challenge with an iron will. Troops were sent marching into the countryside, their boots echoing in the night like a promise of retribution. The rebellious peasants, emboldened by the false prophet Elias Yarkov, found their homes in flames and their friends in chains. Torture was not whispered about in the shadow sit, was carried out in broad daylight, a warning to all who would dream of a world beyond the queen's grasp. Yarkov himself was captured like a prize hawk, locked in an iron cage and dragged through the capital's crowded streets. In the final act of this cruel theater, he was executed for all to see, and with his death, Katrina's message rang clear. To challenge the crown was to forfeit your soul. For Katrina, it was a moment of reckoning. The queen, who had once spoken so passionately of justice and progress, saw the raw chaos that lurked behind every hopeful word. She felt it in her bones the way the kingdom could unravel in a single breath of treachery. The Pugachev Rebellion, as the people would come to call it, stripped the illusions from her mind like winter wind tearing through a garden in bloom. Katrina was no longer the idealistic princess who had scribbled down dreams of equality by candlelight. She was a monarch who understood that to survive, you sometimes had to betray the very ideals that had first lit your fire. She didn't waste time pretending she hadn't changed. After the rebellion's embers cooled, she tightened her grip. Instead of tearing down the old structures, she propped them up with fresh resolve. Serfdom, once a system she had hoped to abolish, grew even more powerful under her reign. The nobles she had once challenged found themselves more secure than ever. The peasants, those who had dared to rise, were pressed deeper into bondage, their lives mortgaged to the power of the lords who held Katrina's throne steady. It was a bitter contradiction. To the philosophers of Europe, Katrina still shone like a beacon of enlightened monarchy ruler who built theaters, funded schools, and debated the nature of freedom in letters that crackled with wit. But within Nordheim's borders, she was no longer just the philosopher queen. She was an empress of cold resolve, a woman who had learned that ideals alone could not hold a kingdom together. Yet perhaps that was the true genius of Katrina's rule. She saw what other dreamers refused to acknowledge, that in a world built on shifting alliances and mortal fear, sometimes you had to wear your convictions like armor, and sometimes you had to set them aside entirely. Her words of liberty were gilded, but the hands that wielded them were sheathed in steel. And Katrina's kingdom did not stop at the rolling hills of Nordheim. Her mind had grown too large for the borders she inherited. She dreamed not of defending her realm, but of expanding Etov, weaving new territories into the tapestry of her empire. She looked first to the south, where the warm waters of the Azure Sea lapped against the shores of the Krivani Peninsula. The Krivani lands had long been caught in the slow death of the Morvan Sultanate, their trade routes choked and their people restless. Katrina saw opportunity in every crumbling wall. The wars that followed were long and brutal, waged in mountain passes and storm-lashed harbors. Katrina's armies, guided by her trusted ally and one-time lover Gregor Palkin, fought with ruthless efficiency. They moved not as conquerors, but as architects of a new order. By 1783, the Krivani Peninsula was Nordheim's to command. With it came access to the Azure Sea, new gateway to trade, and a seat at the table of the great maritime powers. Katrina had turned her kingdom from a landlocked nation into a coastal empire, and she did it with the same quiet determination that had stolen the throne a lifetime ago. But her ambition did not pause to rest. She turned her gaze westward next, to the fractured kingdom of Polvoria, a land weakened by decades of political squabbling and betrayal. Katrina posed as a protector, a shield against Polvoria's self-inflicted wounds. But behind her offers of aid was a blade sharpened for division. In 3 careful stages, Katrina and her allies in the courts of Ultoria and Prisson carved Polvoria like a banquet feast. By the final partition in 1795, Polvoria was gone, its proud history dissolved into a new chapter written by Nordheim's queen. Katrina's empire now sprawled wider than any could have imagined. More than 200 0 square miles of new land lay beneath her scepter. New subjects: Ukrainians, Belarusians, Lithuanians, Tatars, and Jews swelled the empire's ranks, their cultures woven into the fabric of a realm that grew heavier and more complex with every conquest. Yet even as her empire grew, so too did its challenges. The new territories were wild and restless. Some yearned for independence, others for the comfort of old ways. Katrina responded not with brute force alone, but with a patient mind. She reorganized provinces, standardizing the chaotic patchwork of laws and customs. She built schools where none had stood before and demanded reports from every corner of her realm. It was a race against the creeping tide of unrest, and Katrina ran it with relentless energy. To the outside world, Katrina framed her expansion as the march of civilization itself. In letters to kings and ministers across Europe, she cast her conquests as a triumph of reason over barbarism, a mission to bring light where darkness had reigned for too long. To her allies, she was a diplomat of rare skill. To her enemies, she was an imperial predator, her hunger masked by elegance. But to history, she became something altogether different, a ruler who took the game of empires and played it like a master, not with reckless wars, but with the cunning of a chess grandmaster. Even as her hair turned silver and her body slowed, the fire in Katrina's mind never dulled. Well into her 60s, she still rose before dawn to read dispatches and draft new decrees. She still stood at the head of her court, cloaked in velvet and command, her eyes missing nothing. But while Katrina's mind remained sharp, the world around her was changing with terrifying speed. In 1789, the flames of revolution leapt from Paris and spread across the continent like a plague of ideas. The French Revolution, a storm of blood and hope, unsettled every crowned head in Europe. Kings fell to the guillotine. Crowds howled for liberty and justice, words Katrina herself had once used to inspire her reign. For the queen who had built her kingdom on the delicate balance of ideals and iron, the revolution was a specter that refused to be banished. Katrina, once the darling of philosophers, saw their words twisted into weapons. She banned the revolutionary texts that had once thrilled her, silenced the voices of dissent with the stroke of her pen, and transformed her court from a salon of ideas into a fortress of caution. The Enlightenment, it seemed, had found its limits in the world Katrina ruled. And as the decades weighed on her, Katrina's once brilliant circle grew smaller. The love of her life, Gregor Polkinth-man, who had been both her flame and her shadow, was gone, and with him a part of her heart that no empire could fill. But even as she grew more alone, Katrina never let the loneliness show. She wore her solitude like she wore her crown, with pride, with discipline, and with the quiet certainty that every word she spoke still carried the weight of a kingdom. So, let us pause here tonight at the height of Katrina's power, with an empire that stretched beyond the dreams of her childhood, and a world around her trembling on the edge of revolution. Let us know where you're listening from, and whether you can feel the tension in the air, the hush of history holding its breath, because this is not the end of Katrina's tale. The queen who claimed a throne in the dead of night would not be so easily forgotten, nor so easily defeated. When Gregor Polkin passed away in 1791, the loss cut deeper than any political wound. Their passion had long since cooled into a partnership of minds, but his absence left Katrina, the unrelenting feeling, strangely hollow. She kept moving forward. Of course, she was a queen. After all, but those late-night conversations of strategy and ambition no longer echoed in her halls. She filled the void with new favorites, charming young men who sparkled at court like polished silver, but never matched the keen brilliance that Polkin had brought to her side. And then there was her son, Prince Maximilian. Katrina had always eyed him warily, seeing none of her own hard-earned discipline in his restless spirit. Where she calculated, he raged. Where she balanced dreams with survival, he lunged for glory with reckless abandon. She recognized the same streak of autocracy in him that she had worked so carefully to avoid, a dangerous passion that could unmake a kingdom as quickly as any rebellion. Behind closed doors, Katrina considered a different future altogether. She whispered plans to her trusted circle, plans that would pass the crown not to Maximilian, but to his son, young Alexander. The boy had his grandmother's keen mind and her careful caution. Katrina believed he could be molded into the kind of sovereign the empire needed, a ruler not just of armies and titles, but of hearts and minds. But destiny, that silent chessmaster, played a different hand. In November of 1796, Katrina suffered a massive stroke. She fell in her private chambers, her quill slipping from her fingers, the ink of unfinished reforms still wet on the page. She never woke again. For days, the palace was hushed, the air heavy with the knowledge that the woman who had bent an empire to her will was gone. She died alone in a room that smelled of old paper and quiet dreams that would never see the light of dawn. When Maximilian finally took the throne, his first act was to undo the careful web his mother had spun. He reversed many of her policies, his first proclamation a slap in the face of her memory. And in a final twist of irony, he ordered her burial in the grand crypt of St. Leon's Basilica, laid side by side with the husband she had once overthrown, Leopold, the man she had watched with cold eyes as he squandered his birthright. In death they were united in stone, though in life they had never truly been one. The court wore black in mourning. The kingdom paused in solemn respect. And across the oceans and mountains, Europe watched the passing of a monarch who had shaped a century with nothing more than the sharp edge of her mind and the iron of her will. Katrina, the unrelenting, had reigned for 34 years, and in that time she had turned a modest northern kingdom into a force that commanded respect on every battlefield and in every council chamber. Her legacy was a complicated tapestry of contradictions. Katrina was a queen who spoke of justice and reason, who invited the greatest minds of Europe to her table and debated them with passion and precision. She dreamed of freeing the common folk from the weight of their burdens, of building a realm where opportunity was not just the privilege of birth, but the reward of talent. And yet, when those same ideals threatened her power, she cast them aside with ruthless clarity. She expanded serfdom even as she spoke of equality. She tightened the bonds of the nobles even as she dreamed of liberty. In her reign, progress was always balanced on the blade of survival. Yet no one could deny what she achieved. Katrina modernized Nordheim's tangled bureaucracy, transforming it into a machine of precision and ambition. She built schools and hospitals, raised libraries and theaters from the dust, and turned Altenburg from a frozen citadel into a beacon of learning and culture. Under her steady hand, the kingdom grew not just in land but in vision. Trade flourished. Armies marched with new discipline. Foreign emissaries who once dismissed Nordheim as a backward realm now sent gifts and treaties, seeking a place at the queen's table. She ruled in a world built for Menand. She beat them at their own game. Her court was a swirl of powerful advisors, dashing lovers, and scheming diplomats, but Katrina was always the one in control. She knew that love and power were two sides of the same coin, and she played both with a gambler's nerve. Every whispered promise, every velvet-clad night of intrigue was part of her larger visiona, vision that never faltered, even in the darkest hours. Katrina turned the icy capital of Altenburg into a city that echoed with music and ideas. She expanded her borders until her maps ran out of space to mark them. She left behind statues that watched over city squares and libraries that whispered of her restless mind. But perhaps her greatest legacy was something more subtle, more dangerous, too. Katrina proved that a woman could hold an empire in her hands. She showed that sheer intellect, relentless will, and the ability to read the hearts of those around her could shatter the cages of tradition. She rose from a minor princess in a backwater court to a queen who would shape the fate of millions. Not with revolution, but with careful calculation. Not with chaos, but with the quiet certainty of her own worth. To some, Katrina remains a Tyrantan empress who ruled with cold detachment, who bent the kingdom to her will with little regard for the cost. To others, she is a goddess of reason, a monarch who dared to dream of progress in a world that still clung to the darkness of feudal chains. But to history itself, she is something more complicated, more human. She is the reminder that power is never given freely, that it is claimed, kept, and paid for in the currency of blood and brilliance. Katrina the Unrelenting didn't just rule Nordheim. She redefined it. She tore up the script of what a ruler should be and wrote her own story in the ink of conquest, love, and ruthless ambition. And though she died alone, the echoes of her reign still ring in the marble halls she once walked, in the songs of the poets who immortalized her name, and in the very stones of a city that had once been little more than a dream. Her final chapter was written not with fanfare, but with the steady hand of history, a hand that remembers every contradiction, every triumph, and every heartbreak. Katrina proved that destiny belongs not to those born with crowns, but to those who dare to wear them. And in the quiet after her final breath, the world turned its gaze from the queen who had shaped it to the future. She left behind one forever, marked by the touch of a woman who refused to be forgotten. When the Spanish adventurers reached the shores of the New World in the early 1500s, they brought with them not just swords and crosses, but a fever of greed that could not be cooled by reason or distance. They heard the word El Dorado and didn't stop to wonder if it was a person, a ceremony, or a fleeting dream. To them, it was a promise, a city built of gold, a kingdom that glimmered under the sun, untouched by the dust of centuries or the echoes of war. In the minds of these men ragged with hunger, hollow-eyed from endless sea voyages, El Dorado was not a ritual of devotion or a man clad in golden dust. It was a kingdom beyond imagination, a land where rivers ran with molten treasure and every tree hung heavy with gems. It didn't matter that the true story was more complex, a song of rivers and priests and emerald offerings to ancient gods. In the hearts of the Spaniards, it became a fever that would not be cured. The transformation of El Dorado was swift and merciless. The Spanish imagination, fed by tales half heard and twisted, by desperate hope, turned it from a man into a city, then into an empire. They saw not the careful ceremonies of the Muisca people, but a shining promise of salvation and unending wealth. In their minds, El Dorado became paradise itself, a place that could wash away the sins of conquest and fill their empty bellies with silver and gold. For men who had crossed oceans and faced down storms to stand on the edge of this new world, the idea of El Dorado was too sweet to ignore. The jungles of South America, so thick and tangled they seemed to breathe, were alive with rumor. The indigenous people spoke in careful words, some seeking to placate their invaders, others to mislead them into the endless green. They told stories of distant lands, of rivers that swallowed the sun, and of shimmering objects seen only in dreams. The Spanish, their ears tuned to the music of greed, heard every word as a map. They heard El Dorado in every whisper, every glint of riverstone. In their letters home and their drunken songs around the fire, the legend grew larger and more golden. Soldiers still in Spain sang ballads of this city they had never seen. Poets embroidered its walls with verses of hope and conquest. Kings and queens, seated on their velvet thrones, funded expeditions that promised glory in return for faith and gold. It no longer mattered if the city existed. What mattered was the hunger it stirred. In the age of conquest, belief itself was the engine of destiny. And El Dorado, this mirage of gold and grandiose, all the belief they needed. This obsession would forge heroes and destroy them in equal measure. It became the brightest lure in the dark waters of exploration, a legend that shimmered just beyond the next river bend, just past the next mountain. And always it remained out of reach, a golden phantom that drew men deeper into the heart of the jungle. In 1541, the fever claimed one of its most famous victims, Gonzalo de Alvarez, a ruthless captain and the brother of Francisco Alvarez, the man who had already broken the Incan Empire, set his sights on the Golden City. Gonzalo had heard the whispers of forests filled with cinnamon, of mountains that glowed like copper at dusk, of a city called El Dorado waiting just beyond the white peaks of the Andes. He was determined to find it, no matter how many lives it cost. He assembled an army of over 300 Spanish soldiers, hundreds of indigenous porters pressed into servitude, a small herd of horses, and a mountain of desperate dreams. The jungles of the upper Amazon did not care for any of it. The rain fell in endless sheets, turning paths to rivers and rivers to oceans. The dense canopy of the forest turned day to green twilight. Supplies rotted in the wet air. Insects feasted on human flesh without mercy. Soldiers who had crossed oceans in gleaming armor now found themselves crawling on their knees, their dreams rusted and broken. As the days became weeks and weeks became months, Gonzalo's great army began to dissolve. Food vanished like morning mist. Discipline crumbled. Many of the porters died in the mud or slipped away into the forest, choosing freedom over the promise of a city that might not exist. The Spaniards, weighed down by their iron plates and the useless finery of civilization, became hollow, men-haunted, starved, and suspicious of even the air they breathed. Desperation gnawed at Gonzalo's mind. In the end, he split his forces. He ordered a smaller party to forge ahead, to find food and a path out of the green hell. That group was led by Francisco de Oranaga, a lesser noble with more nerve than rank, a man whose name would become legend in its own right. Oranaga took his ragged band and set them afloat on a river that twisted through the heart of the forest like a silver snake. The river became their lifeline, their only hope of salvation or doom. As days stretched into weeks, Oranaga realized he could never turn back. The river's current was a one-way path, and the forest closed behind them like a living tomb. With nothing but faith and hunger to drive them, Oranaga and his handful of men built a rough brigantinea boat, more dream than vessel, and let the river take them deeper and deeper into the unknown. They sailed past towering trees that had never felt an axe, past villages that watched them with wary eyes and silent judgment. Oranaga claimed later to have seen cities rising from the jungle-vast civilizations that defied the Spanish image of savagery. He spoke of grand halls and marketplaces bustling with life, of women warriors who guarded their lands with bows and cold glares. These stories, half truth, half delirium, would become the fuel that kept the myth of El Dorado burning for centuries to come. Eventually, Oranaga and his battered companions emerged from the endless green, their bodies thin as shadows, their eyes wide with the memory of what they had seen and what they had imagined. They reached the salt-kissed mouth of the great river, the ocean itself. Oranaga became the first European to navigate the entire length of what would later be called the Orana River, known to us now as the Amazon. He found no city of gold. No El Dorado waited for him beyond the final bend. All he found was the realization that the myth had become larger than any truth. But in the letters he sent homewards, written by a man half broken and half reborn, he spoke of wonders that could not be denied, and that was enough to keep the fever alive. Back in the mountains, Gonzalo de Alvarez's forces fared far worse. His soldiers staggered back to Quito, what was left of them skeletal, sick, and filled with stories that twisted in the retelling. The jungle had devoured them as a river swallows a stone, and yet the hunger for El Dorado only grew. The myth had claimed its first real blood, and in doing so, had become something that no mere conquest could kill. By the middle of the 1500s, the Spanish obsession had shifted from the boundless green of the jungle to a single, desperate certainty. Somewhere, El Dorado must exist. The story had grown too large to be contained by rivers or reason. It was no longer about a man in gold or a city lost to time. It was about a promise that could never be fulfilled, a dream that no truth could ever slay. El Dorado was no longer a place. It was a direction, a calling, a fever that would shape the fate of every explorer who dared to chase it into the endless wild. Tucked away in the lush highlands of what is now central Colombia lies a place that seems to pulse with secrets, Lake Guatavina. The nearly perfect circle of its waters glimmers like an eye set in the earth, cool and watchful. But what drew the conquerors here was not the tranquil beauty of the lake. It was the legend that had seeped into every ripple of its surface, a tale older than the dust on their boots. For the Muisca people, the lake was a place of prayer, of offerings given to the spirits that watched over the valleys and the skies. One ritual in particular captured the European imagination like a flame in the dark. It spoke of a chieftain naked, his skin glimmering under a layer of golden dust, who drifted out to the center of the lake on a raft, casting emeralds and gold into the depths as gifts to the gods. To the Muisca, it was a covenant, a celebration of harmony between man and spirit, but to the Spanish, it was a voltone they were determined to empty. The first to arrive in 1536 was Gonzalo Jimenez de Quesada, his eyes hungry for more than the soft green of the hills. His soldiers waded along the lake's edge, plucking a few golden trinkets from the shallows, just enough to stoke the fires of obsession that burned through their ranks. The promise of more glittering treasure lying silent beneath the water was too much to ignore. Over the next few decades, the lake drew wave after wave of hopeful plunderers, each one convinced they would be the one to crack its secret heart. In 1580, the most audacious attempt was made by a wealthy Spaniard named Antonio de Sepulveda. Unlike those who had come before, Sepulveda was no mere dreamer. He was a man who thought legends could be conquered by force and ambition. With an army of indigenous laborers pressed into backbreaking work, Sepulveda ordered a massive cut to be carved into the mountain's flank, a channel meant to drain the lake and reveal the treasure that had become his fever dream. For weeks they labored, earth and stone giving way under sweat and desperation. As the water began to recede, mud and ancient roots rose to the surface, along with a few flecks of gold that only deepened the frenzy. But the earth has a way of swallowing secrets whole. Before Sepulveda could finish his brutal task, the sides of the channel collapsed in a thunder of rock and water. The workersmen, who had never seen gold except in the dreams of others, were buried alive in the landslide. A few golden trinkets surfaced, glinting like the last laugh of the lake itself, but the vast treasure that Sepulveda had imagined remained out of reach, sealed beneath layers of silt and myth. In the centuries that followed, Lake Guatavina became something more than just a setting in the El Dorado legend. It became the legend's living heart, a place where the promise of gold had been sung in whispered prayers long before the Spaniards arrived. And though the lake refused to reveal its secrets, it kept its power-drawing treasure hunters armed with sonar and scuba gear, their minds filled with visions of glittering relics. Even when dynamite echoed across the hills, the lake remained unmoved. It promised everything and gave nothing, the perfect reflection of the myth it had come to embody. By the late 16th century, the fever that had first gripped the Spanish was no longer theirs alone. The English, ambitious, restless, and eager to challenge Spain's rule over the sea, turned their gaze to the Golden City as well. And none among them was more bewitched by the dream of El Dorado than Sir Walter Raleigh. Raleigh was a poet and a soldier, a favorite of Queen Elizabeth's glittering court, and a man who believed that fate had chosen him for greatness. El Dorado was not just a legend to him, it was his destiny, the chance to carve a story that would outshine the chronicles of the Spanish conquerors. In 1595, Raleigh launched an expedition to Guyana, a wild and little-mapped region in what is now Venezuela, near the sinuous curve of the Orinoco River. He had read the Spanish reports tales of cinnamon forests and rivers of goldant. He believed with every fiber of his being that the city of gold lay hidden somewhere in that steamy, tangled land. The journey was a crucible. The thick jungles pressed in on them, heat and humidity turning each breath into a struggle. The rivers ran swift and treacherous, and the ground seemed to shift beneath their boots. Raleigh pressed on, driven by the conviction that El Dorado was not just a phantom, it was waiting for him just beyond the next ridge, the next bend in the river. When he returned to England, he carried no gold in his hands, but a story in his mouth that would ignite the hearts of dreamers and cynics alike. He spoke of a land on the cusp of discovery, of a mighty emperor, and a city glinting in the sun. His published account, The Discovery of the Large, Rich, and Beautiful Empire of Guyana, was a masterstroke of persuasion, vague maps, and tantalizing details woven together in a tapestry of possibility. There was no proof, but proof was never the heart of the legend. The mere suggestion was enough. Queen Elizabeth was intrigued. The public was captivated. Raleigh's name rose like a star, and in every alehouse and parlor, men spoke of El Dorado as if they had glimpsed its golden towers in their dreams. But time is a merciless judge. Elizabeth died, and with her, Raleigh's favor at court began to fade. He fell from grace and into a cell in the Tower of London, a prisoner of a new king who had no love for adventurers. Yet, even in his cell, the myth still burned in Raleigh's mind. In 1617, after years of confinement, he was granted one last chance, a final expedition to prove his tales true and reclaim his place in history. But destiny had other plans. This time, Raleigh's men clashed with a Spanish outpost, violating the fragile peace between England and Spain. Worse still, his beloved son, Wat, was cut down in the skirmish. A bright life ended by a dream that would not die. Raleigh returned to England empty-handed, the ghost of El Dorado haunting his every breath. King James was furious. In 1618, Raleigh was led to the scaffold and beheaded, his life ended by the same myth he had once made shine like polished brass. He had chased a city that may never have existed, and in doing so, became its most tragic pilgrim. Yet El Dorado did not die with him. With every failed expedition, the legend grew stronger, more luminous in the imaginations of those who had never seen the forests or felt the crush of mud beneath their feet. It shimmered like a mirage that retreated with every step forward, a promise that no gold could buy. Even centuries later, the fever still flickers in the hearts of those who stand on the shores of Lake Guaravina, the waters as quiet as a prayer. They lean over the edge, peering into the darkness below, wondering what might be waiting, what might still lie hidden beneath centuries of silt and silence. And in that hush, El Dorado lives on, a city of gold, a kingdom of dreams, and a myth that will never die as long as there are those who dare to chase the horizon. Imagine a place where the green of the jungle is so deep and endless it feels like the very breath of the earth itself. This was the canvas on which the legend of El Dorado was painted, a place of infinite possibility and even more infinite danger. The emerald embrace of the Amazon was both a promise and a predator, luring men into its depths and swallowing them whole. They came from every corner of the old world, driven by a fever that could not be cooled by logic or caution. Portuguese treasure hunters, German wanderers, Dutch traders with pockets as empty as their maps, and Jesuit priests who claimed they sought only souls to save. Each one carried a story of gold, a weapon to defend it, and a mind that could be broken by the weight of it all. The Amazon rainforest, a kingdom of roots and rivers that spanned millions of square kilometers, was more than they could ever hope to tame. The canopy above turned the sun to dappled shadows, an eternal twilight where direction was an illusion. Rivers curved and twisted like serpents, their currents changing without reason, their waters hiding unseen dangers. Poison was everywhere, tiny insects with stings that burned like hellfire, snakes that moved like water itself. Starvation was always close, and disease closer still. Those who managed to crawl deeper into the green labyrinth found that the forest itself was only part of the threat. The people who lived there, guardians of lands that had never known a European footstep, defended their homes with precision and a fierce pride that no musket could break. Again and again, the same pattern repeated, a rumor of riches, an expedition paid for in blood and silver, weeks of brutal struggle, and then silence. Vanished without a trace, the only legacy of these men, a whisper in the leaves. Yet the fever never died. Every disappearance only made the myth stronger. El Dorado was no longer just a single city or a kingdom of gold. It became a reflection of every hope and every delusion. Some believed it lay hidden in the white peaks of the Andes, a kingdom in the clouds. Others were certain it slept deep in the green heart of the jungle, guarded by spirits and rivers of molten gold. In some tales, it was a cave lit by crystal light. In others, it was a lake where the gods themselves bathed. With each retelling, the shape of the dream shifted, as elusive and shimmering as a mirage. And that, in the end, was what made it so deadly. The jungle did not need walls or armies to guard its secret. It needed only time and the human mind which could so easily become its own worst enemy. Men stumbled deeper and deeper, driven by hope that burned brighter than the sun overhead, until exhaustion or betrayal turned them into shadows of themselves. Some went mad, their eyes haunted by visions of gold they would never touch. Others turned on each other, blades drawn in the moonlight, the line between brother and rival erased by the hunger in their hearts. Even those who survived brought back stories that were half delirium, half nightmare. They spoke of glimpses of idols that glowed like fire, of distant lights that flickered in the green darkness, of voices that echoed through the trees when there should have been only silence. Their minds, half starved and half lost, became compasses that spun wildly in every direction. El Dorado had become more than a place. It was a labyrinth of the mind, a promise that demanded everything in return. For centuries, the myth of El Dorado was dismissed by scholars and skeptics alike as nothing more than a beautiful lié fantasy born of greed and the arrogance of those who thought the world could be bent to their will. But in the last few decades, something astonishing has come to light. Pieces of a puzzle, long hidden beneath centuries of green and silence, have begun to emerge. Archaeologists and scientists, armed with satellite eyes and careful hands, have found echoes of civilizations that once thrived in these lands that conquistadors called empty. In Brazil, in Bolivia, in Peru, the outlines of ancient cities have emerged: geometric mounds, earthworks shaped with purpose, the shadows of roads and canals that once wove entire nations together. These were not camps of a few dozen souls scratching at the dirt. These were organized societies, sophisticated and enduring, home to tens of thousands who understood the rhythm of the forest and how to shape it to their needs. In scattered patches of the Amazon, researchers have found patches of earth that defy the rules of the natural world terra preta, dark soil that was carefully engineered by human hands. Rich with charcoal, bones, and compost, it is a sign of a people who knew how to make the forest feed them, not just swallow them whole. It suggests a civilization that understood what it meant to last, not for a season or a single reign, but for generations. Could it be that when the first European explorers spoke of grand cities and golden kings, they were not just inventing dreams, but glimpsing the last flickers of a world already dying? A world that had been ravaged by the diseases and violence that came with the Spanish sails, its cities fading back into the green before they could ever be fully understood. Some scholars think so. Even the wild tales of Francisco de Oranaga, once dismissed as the ravings of a man lost to the jungle, are being seen in a new light. His talk of vast settlements and warrior women was once a joke in the halls of European courts. But now, the evidence suggests he may have been telling the truth, just a version of it that Europe was too blind to see. So perhaps El Dorado was never a single golden city, never a place you could find on a map. Perhaps it was a memoria reflection of the many real kingdoms that once thrived in the Amazon, a patchwork of cultures and cities that dazzled the eyes of outsiders and then slipped away beneath the weight of vines and time. The myth, it turns out, was not a lie born from nothing. It was born from fragments of truth, misunderstood and reshaped by the greed and wonder of those who came searching. The gold may have been symbolic, the grandeur exaggerated, but the roots of the story were always real, buried in the dark soil and the silent green. As the legend of El Dorado spread across Europe, it didn't just live in the songs of sailors or the murmurs of poets. It was carved into the very maps that charted the world's new edges. From the 16th to the 18th centuries, cartographer shelf artists half-dreamers took the blank spaces of the New World and filled them with invention. The unknown was both terrifying and tantalizing, a canvas begging for color, and nothing colored it better than the promise of gold. On yellowed maps and weathered parchments, the word El Dorado was written in curling script, pinned to rivers that twisted like serpents and mountains that had never been climbed. Sometimes the city was drawn nestled near Lake Guadavina, a glimmering beacon in the green. Other times it floated like a phantom in the depths of the Amazon, or hid behind the icy breath of the Andes. With every stroke of the pen, the myth grew until it was not just a place, but a kingdom of the mind, waiting for those who were brave enough or foolish enough to chase it. And chase it they did again and again, across centuries and continents, until the line between truth and dream blurred like the mists that rose each dawn in the forest. In the heart of those ancient maps lay more than ink and parchment. There was a promise, a seduction that could not be ignored. Some maps bore the name Orunino, a fanciful flourish that claimed to pinpoint the city of gold itself, etched in winding rivers and towering peaks that had never been touched by a single European boot. On these maps, entire empires of gold rose from the page, complete with drawn temples that reached for the sun, towers that glowed like captured dawn, and guardians as fantastical as dragon's creatures, meant to both terrify and entice. These maps were not meant to fool, not entirely. They were created to Celto kings eager for conquest, to merchants dreaming of cargoes that would fill their ledgers with treasure, to adventurers whose courage outstripped their caution. Every brushstroke and flourish was a siren song, a carefully spun web of possibility that turned distant lands into kingdoms of the mind. The beauty of these maps lay in their uncertainty. The less precise the lines, the more room there was for the imagination to run wild. And so, with every new edition, with every copy passed from hand to trembling hand, the legend grew until it was not just a story but a geography of desire. Some of these maps found their way to the gilded halls of royal courts, where they were unrolled on marble tables under the watchful eyes of those who would fund the next expedition. Others appeared in books pages that smelled of ink and candle smoke, passed among scholars and dreamers alike. They were copied, borrowed, and shamelessly embellished. With each new iteration, the city of gold became more real, more undeniable, until it was no longer just a dream but a destination. The consequences of these illusions were painfully real. Men set sail on oceans that had no end, drawn by the promise of rivers that had never existed. They traded their lives for the chance to chase a glimmer on a page. Entire forests were cut down to build the ships that carried them to fates they could not imagine. Some never returned. Some returned as husks of the men they had been, their minds as hollow as their empty pockets. Entire empires were claimed on the strength of these painted lieslands taken by men who believed that to name something was to own it. And yet, the most haunting truth is this. Even after the world learned that El Dorado was a mirage, those maps still found eager eyes. They were not just relics of an age of conquest. They were testaments to the power of the human mind to dream beyond reason. Because a map is not only a record of what is a testament to what we wish could be. Even today, these ancient maps are prized treasures, sought by collectors who care nothing for accuracy and everything for the story they tell. They are windows into a time when belief itself was currency. They remind us that hope does not fade because it is proven falsight fades only when we let it go. And El Dorado, drawn in sweeping lines across fragile pages, never needed to be real. It only needed to be imagined. Centuries have passed since those first fevered whispers of a city of gold. The jungle has claimed the bones of those who chased its phantom promise, covering their footprints with green silence. Rusted swords and broken helmets lie beneath roots that have never known the touch of sun. Yet the myth lives on, woven into the fabric of our stories, our films, our whispered dreams. It is the treasure that never fades, the flickering light in every mind that dares to look beyond the horizon. It is Indiana Jones in the flickering glow of a movie screen. It is the road to El Dorado drawn in animated wonder. It is a symbol now, more than a place, more than a man. It is the idea that somewhere out there, in the quiet spaces where maps end and mystery begins, there is still a secret worth finding. Even in the 19th and 20th centuries, when science and reason were supposed to tame the wild edges of the world, the call of El Dorado never truly fell silent. Alexander von Humboldt, one of the most respected scientific minds of his day, ventured deep into the green labyrinth of South America in the early 1800s. Though he carried the skepticism of an Enlightenment scholar, he could not escape the pull of the stories he heard. He did not seek gold but truth itself, and he found that even truth was woven with the threads of legend. Decades later, another name would be added to the roll call of those who vanished into the myth. Percy Fawcett, a British explorer who believed with every fiber of his being that there was a lost city in the Amazon, called it simply Z. His obsession mirrored that of the conquistadors centuries before. In 1925, he led an expedition with his son into the green silence and was never seen again. Some say he was killed by those who guarded their home with unbreakable pride. Others whisper that he found what he was looking for and chose to vanish into the story itself. Even now, in the 21st century, the search has not ended. The tools have changed: satellites that see through clouds, drones that fly where no human can walk, ground-penetrating radar that reads the earth like an ancient manuscript. But the dream remains the same. Archaeologists and scientists comb the Amazon's hidden heart, peeling back layers of green to find the footprints of civilizations that thrived long before the first Spanish sails appeared on the horizon. No city of gold has been found. Yet what they have discovered, the earthworks, the geometric mounds, the ghostly outlines of roads, suggests something grander than gold, the memory of a world that once pulsed with life and knowledge. These discoveries do not end the myth of El Dorado. They give it new breath. They reveal that the legend was never about one city, one empire of golden walls. It was about the human hunger to find what is hidden, to chase what seems just out of reach. In those ancient earthworks, in the dark soil that still remembers the hands that shaped it, we see the glimmers of something more precious than any coin. The proof that the human spirit has always been drawn to the mystery that lies just beyond the next bend in the river. And so El Dorado endures. It endures because we need it to. Because in every heart there is the quiet belief that there is more out there, one last secret that could change everything. We are still driven by the promise that if we go far enough, risk enough, and dare to dream enough, we will find that golden city not in the jungles of South America, but in the courage of our own hearts. El Dorado is no longer a dot on a map, no longer a shimmering city of gold nestled between jagged peaks and emerald rivers. Today, it's something more potent, a symbol of the very hunger that drives us forward. It's the echo of ambition, the fever of obsession, the quiet voice in the back of every mind that asks, what if there's more just beyond what we can see? It lives on in the way we chase the perfect job, the perfect partner, the perfect dream. We seek it in our careers, in the winding path of relationships, in the corners of the world that call to us with promises of wonder. It doesn't matter if El Dorado was ever real in the strictest sense. What matters is that we keep moving toward it, our eyes fixed on that flicker of gold on the horizon. In the end, no one ever found El Dorado, kingdom of gilded walls. No thrones carved from emerald and jade. No treasure that could be weighed and counted. The forest never opened its green embrace to reveal the riches that obsessed so many. But El Dorado's legacy outlasted every kingdom that tried to claim it, every soldier who died chasing it. Because what the explorers never truly understood, what they couldn't see, even as they hacked through vines and waded through river swaths, that the real treasure was never gold. It was what the journey demanded of them, the lessons carved into their bones, the truths that reshaped their vision of the world. They found rivers that no map had dared to draw. They met people who understood the forest not as an enemy but as a home, with knowledge that eclipsed the dusty tomes of European libraries. They heard languages that sang with the pulse of a land untouched by conquest, saw customs that spoke of an entirely different way of being. Some, like Francisco de Oranaga, stumbled upon history by accident, not by discovering El Dorado, but by charting the first true paths into the heart of the world's largest rainforest. Others lost everything: gold, sanity, life itself. Yet even they became part of the legend. Their names echo across centuries, not for what they found, but for what they were willing to risk, for the sheer audacity of believing that something wondrous lay just out of sight. El Dorado endures because it speaks to something woven into the very marrow of our species, the belief that there is always more to see, more to learn, more to become. We hear it in the quiet voice that says, keep going, in the shadow of doubt that can't quench the spark of hope. The entrepreneur chasing a dream that won't let him sleep. The artist laboring over a canvas that will never be finished. The traveler who finds home in every distant shore. They are all seeking their own golden city, a place that may not exist but still shapes every breath they take. The myth is not a failure. It is a mirror. It reflects our hunger for meaning, our insatiable curiosity, and yes, the dangerous spark of our greed. It shows how far we'll go for something beautiful, for something that makes our hearts race and our minds burn. It is a testament to the human spirit, flawed and fragile and relentless. El Dorado is not a city. It is a question, and every generation, in every corner of the world, finds its own way to answer it. Because the real El Dorado is not out there in the green embrace of the Amazon or the dusty halls of a crumbling palace. It's in the journey itself, the choice, to keep walking, even when the map runs out, even when the jungle closes in. So the next time you hear a story that seems too beautiful, too perfect, ask yourself, is it a lie, or is it a dream worth chasing? Because sometimes, the journey is its own reward, the only El Dorado we will ever truly find. Long before the world knew of gold-laden cities or legends of lost empires, another stage was being set far from the jungles of the New World. In the cradle of ancient Greece, under the watchful eyes of marble gods, the seeds of the Olympic Games were being sown, but they were not born in pursuit of medals or glory. They were born as an act of reverence, a way of reaching for the divine. It was the year 776 BCE, in a landscape carved by mountains and valleys, where the olive trees whispered secrets older than any mortal tongue. People gathered from across the Greek world, not to trade or to wage war, but to honor something larger than themselves. The place was called Olympia Sanctuary, hidden in the heart of the Peloponnesian Peninsula, a place of quiet devotion and fierce competition. There was no city here, no fortress of stone, only a sacred grove, shaded by olive trees, and watched over by statues of gods whose gaze never wavered. At the center stood an altar built from the ashes of generations of sacrifice, a mound of devotion that reached skyward like a question posed to the heavens. Here, in this humble clearing, the Olympic Games were born not in the roar of a stadium, but in the flickering light of ritual fires. Before a single race was run, before the discus soared through the air or the javelin found its mark, the Greeks made offerings to Zeus, king of the gods. Oxen were led to the altar, their breath mingling with the incense that rose in curling smoke to the sky. Hymns echoed in the dawn, voices lifted not in triumph but in gratitude. The first Olympics were not merely games, they were a prayer made in sweat and song. Only Greek men could compete, and only those who were free. They came from every corner of the Hellenic world: Athens, Corinth, Argos, and Spartish, man carrying the pride of his polis like a shield. There were no cheering crowds of thousands, no blaring announcements or glittering medals. But there was something in the Ira, sense of something sacred, a pause in the endless rivalries of city-states that allowed these men to see one another not as enemies, but as brothers beneath the gaze of the gods. For a few days, the world held its breath. Language and politics fell away. The Greeks remembered that beyond their endless wars and rivalries, they shared a single heartbeat. They gathered barefoot and bronzed from the summer sun, some of them traveling for weeks just to stand in that hallowed place. Competition was not merely permitted, it was a form of worship. It was how mortal men reached for the perfection the gods had placed just out of reach. There was no gold to be won, no silver to weigh the worth of a man's ambition. What mattered was the test itself, the chance to measure the strength of one's body and the discipline of one's soul against the ideal. The first runners who took their mark did not race for trophies. They raced for the chance to become something more than themselves, stand closer to the divine, if only for the span of a heartbeat. The Olympic Games of ancient Greece were never born of a royal decree. No empire demanded them, no king forced them into being. They rose from something older and deeper shared understanding among the Greeks, that beneath all the wars and rivalries, there was a moment when they could stand together, side by side, for something more enduring, than any crown or conquest. Here in the shadows of temples that reached skyward like prayers in stone, the first breath of the Olympics was taken. It was not a sport in the way we know sport today. It was a ritual, an offering to the gods in flesh and motion, a testament to the strength of the human spirit when it was laid bare before the heavens. In a world divided by blood feuds and border wars, the games were a quiet marvel. Every 4 years, as if by a silent command older than any human law, the Greeks found a reason to set down their swords. That reason was Zeus himself. The truce that held back the tide of war was called the Ekacheria, and it was no polite suggestion. It was a solemn, binding covenant. Heralds were dispatched from Elis, the humble region that held stewardship over Olympiado, carry this promise across the rocky coasts and mountain passes. For 1 month, sometimes 3, no army could march. No spear could be raised in anger. Even the most bitter enemies had to open their gates. For to deny passage to an athlete or a priest was to invite the wrath of the gods themselves. It wasn't peace in the way we imagine peace today. It didn't erase old grudges or mend broken alliances. But it was a moment of shared breath, a pause that reminded every Greek that there was something worth more than conquest, the respect of the gods. In theory, this truce meant that any Greek, no matter how far his polis was from the olive groves of Elis, could make the journey to Olympia in safety. In practice, it was a marvel of diplomacy, a delicate dance of pride and humility. City-states that had clashed in open battle one season would find themselves standing shoulder to shoulder on the track the next. Even Sparta, the iron-hearted city of warriors, laid aside its endless defiance to honor the truce in the early years of the games. To violate the Ekacheria was to gamble not just with politics, but with the wrath of Zeus, for at Olympia, the king of the gods was more than a name in a prayer. He was the game's patron and protector, his will made manifest in every race and every throw. A towering bronze statue of Zeus watched over the sanctuary, thunderbolt in hand, a reminder that in this place, human rules bent to something greater. Yet the truce was never just about safety. It was about unity, about the fragile thread that tied the Greek world together across its patchwork of city-states. Greece was not a single nation then, but a tapestry of fierce and fractious polities, each jealously guarding its pride. The Ekacheria was a rare moment, when that tapestry was woven into a single cloth. It was a statement that beyond the clash of shields and the hunger for power, there was a shared reverence that bound them all. And when the truce was in place, Olympia transformed. The olive wreaths were woven with quiet devotion, the altars prepared for the sacrifices that would begin every new games. Athletes stepped forward not as soldiers or citizens, but as living offerings to the gods, their bodies the only testament they needed. In this sacred space, there were no uniforms to mark rank or wealth, no armor to separate noble from commoner. Every athlete stood naked before the gods and his people, nothing to hide and nothing to protect him but his own strength and skill. To the modern mind, the idea of competing unclothed might seem scandalous, but to the ancient Greeks, it was a testament to the divine symmetry of the human body. The word gymnos meant naked, and from it came the term gymnasium, a place where the body was trained and the mind was sharpened. The Greeks believed that the discipline of the flesh was inseparable from the discipline of the spirit. Athletes anointed themselves in olive oil, not for vanity, but to honor the perfection of the form, to protect the skin from the chafe of exertion and the burn of the sun. Dust was scattered over the oil, not just for grip, but to trace the shape of every muscle, every line of effort and will. To compete in the nude was to declare a kind of equality. In that arena, no man could hide behind his fortune or his father's name. All that remained was effort pure and unvarnished. The sweat on their brows was the same. The strain in their lungs was the same. And when the race was run, the victor's olive wreath was not weighted by coin, but by the pride of a people who believed that in the striving, they touched the divine. But this exposure was more than a display of flesh. It was a moral statement. For the Greeks, shame did not lie in the naked body, but in cowardice, in cheating, in weakness of the will. To step onto the track, or into the wrestling pit without clothing was to say, "I have nothing to hide." It was an act of defiance against the darkness of the soul, a vow to stand in the light of the gods' gaze and be judged not by wealth or rank, but by courage. The statues the Greeks left behind still speak of this reverence. Runners frozen mid-stride, discus throwers with backs taut as bowstrings, wrestlers locked in an eternal struggle of muscle and resolve. These were not just images of men, they were ideals. In marble and bronze, the Greeks carved their understanding of virtue, strength, beauty, balance, and the courage to lay it all bare. For a brief moment, every 4 years, the Greeks found a way to transcend their endless rivalries. They found a way to honor not just the gods, but the better angels of their own nature. And so they gathered barefoot, bronzed by the sun, and unashamed, because to them, the games were not about medals or prizes. They were about proving, if only for a heartbeat, that mortal men could stand shoulder to shoulder with the divine. These marble figures were not just decorative flourishes, they were timeless witnesses, capturing in silent stone the soul of Greek heroism. In every carefully carved muscle, every poised expression, the ancient sculptors captured the athlete's sacred struggle. They weren't just celebrating the body, they were immortalizing the triumph of the human spirit, the unspoken prayer of each runner, each wrestler, each champion. Even the gods themselves, Apollo radiant in youth, Heracles crowned in his labors, were often depicted in this same stark, honest nudity, an echo of the mortal contests that unfolded in their honor. But while the male form was celebrated in these contests, women were not even allowed to watch. Married women were barred entirely, and only a handful of unmarried girls priestesses or attendants might be permitted to witness the games. The Olympics were an almost exclusively male domain, a place where strength and competition were laid bare before the eyes of the divine and of fellow men. In this environment, nudity was not a shameful statement, was an act of devotion. To compete unclothed was to become a living offering, a testament of flesh to the gods above. The body was stripped of all pretense, no cloth, no armor, no rank leaving, only the raw truth of what it was, tested, trained, and transformed. The athlete's victory was not for himself alone, but for Zeus, for the polis he represented, for the sacred memory of every race run beneath the thunderous gaze of the heavens. In the earliest days of the games, there was no second prize, no soft cushion of silver or bronze. Victory was singular. It was absolute. There was no podium of 3 steps. There was only the victor, the one man who had managed to seize that fleeting moment of perfection. In every event, only the first-place athlete was honored, crowned with a wreath of wild olive leaves cut from the sacred grove of Zeus himself. This crown, called the kotinos, was no glittering trophy. It was humble, almost ephemeral, no sparkle of gold, no weight of silver. And yet, to the Greeks, it was beyond price. It was a mark of divine favor, a symbol of a mortal man's fleeting glimpse of immortality. To win at Olympia was to have your name woven into eternity, to return to your polis not just as a champion, but as a living monument to excellence. Some of these victors were immortalized in statues that stood in the sanctuary itself, stone and bronze likenesses that watched over the next generation of runners and wrestlers. Poets wove their names into verse, crafting stanzas that carried the sound of their feet and the sweat of their efforts across centuries. Cities lavished them with honors, lifetime seats at the theater, free meals for their families, even places in the council halls of power. But these were not the prizes the athletes ran for. What mattered was the Greek ideal of arete virtue, excellence, the perfection of the self in mind and body. Victory was not just personal, it was political too. Each athlete carried not just his own pride onto the track, but the hopes of his city-state. A victory at Olympia was a statement of the strength of one's home, a living proof that your people were favored by the gods. The glory was shared, the celebration a collective echo. But defeat was bitter, a silence that swallowed names and dreams alike. There were no laurels for second place, no consolation in effort alone. The line between eternal fame and total obscurity was measured in the dust of the track, in a breath held too long, a single slip of the foot. And for those who did not win, history had no place. They returned to their homes unmarked by statues or songs, their names lost in the hush of time. Yet for the victor, the triumph was more than a moment. It was a doorway to immortality. To stand crowned in olive leaves, to feel the weight of silence as the world watched, was to become part of something older and larger than any single life. The Greeks believed that in those fleeting seconds of triumph, the victor was touched by the divine. He was more than mortal. He was a vessel for the perfection that the gods demanded and the earth rarely granted. The first recorded champion in this ancient dance was Coroebos of Elis, a cook by trade, who in 776 BCE sprinted barefoot across the packed earth of the stadium to claim a victory that would outlast empires. His name is still known today, proof that even a humble man, in a single perfect moment, can carve his name into eternity. He won no treasure, no political office, no empire. His prize was a simple wreath and a place in the eternal scroll of Olympic victors. As time moved on, the games grew richer and more varied. By the 7th century BCE, the contests multiplied. The Dolichos tested the lungs and legs of distance runners, who raced through heat and dust for the glory of endurance. The Dialos was a sprint doubled in length, a blur of motion that demanded both speed and stamina. Wrestling was added, its contests of leverage and cunning as sacred as the foot race itself. The discus soared in graceful arcs. The javelin tested the strength of arm and eye. The long jump was measured not just in distance, but in the silent poetry of bodies that soared like prayers. These events were brought together in the pentathlon, brutal gauntlet that demanded not just one skill, but all of them. To win the pentathlon was to prove oneself a true champion, not just in speed or power, but in balance and adaptability, the very essence of a ret. And then there was the pancrasonic contest, so fierce it blurred the line between competition and combat. It was wrestling and boxing combined, with only 2 rules: no biting and no gouging of the eyes. Everything else was permitted. It was a contest of strength and spirit, of unbridled will and cunning. Men left the arena bruised, bloodied, and sometimes broken. Some never left at all. But for those who did, victory was a taste of the divine, a moment when the mortal body became something more than human. And as the centuries passed, the chariot races thundered onto the scene-hundering wheels, straining horses, the ground itself trembling with the weight of ambition. These contests carried not just the glory of the athletes, but the wealth of the men who owned the teams. It was a spectacle of control and risk, a test not only of physical skill but of daring and calculation. In each of these contests, the Greeks saw not just sport, but something sacred, something that spoke to the soul's endless striving for excellence. Each race run, each throw made, was an offering to the gods and a testament to the mortal spirit's refusal to be content with less than perfection. The thunder of hooves was like a heartbeat to the ancient Greeks, a rhythm of life and death that echoed through the dust of the hippodrome. Chariot races were spectacles of chaos and grace, the clash of wood and bone, the flash of wheels that could spin a man's fate in a single turn. Clouds of dust rose as the horses surged forward, their sleek bodies gleaming with sweat. The drivers hunched over the reins with eyes as sharp as the blades of their scythed wheels. Crashes were inevitable, wheels shattering, horses screaming, drivers flung to the earth. It was danger in its purest form, a dance with mortality that the crowds watched with breathless delight. The chariots were not driven by the athletes themselves, but by professional driversmen whose lives were spent in the whip-crack rhythm of the racetrack. Yet in the end, it was not their names that were crowned with olive leaves. The honor, the glory, the sacred wreath all went to the owners of the horses, those wealthy patrons who watched from shaded stands, secure in the knowledge that in this race, status was the truest prize. But all of this, the dust and the crashes, the gilded crowns and the silent prayers, came much later. In the very beginning, in 776 BCE, there was only a single race, the stadion. One sprint, one victor, one beginning. And from that humble seed grew a tradition that transformed the mere motion of limbs into a ceremony of the soul. It was more than a game, it was a vow to the gods, a testament that the body, pushed beyond its mortal comfort, became something divine. As the centuries unfolded, new contests were added like the verses of an epic poem. But the stadion remained the heart of the games, the original song that reminded every competitor and every spectator of where it all began. For in that first race, the Greeks had captured something timeless, the pure, undiluted power of human striving. The Olympic Games were not just a series of competitions. They were rituals as sacred as any prayer. Every leap, every throw, every pulse of sweat carried the weight of something older than memory. In Olympia, sport was worship, the movement of the body an offering laid at the feet of the gods. At the center of all this devotion stood Zeus, the Thunder King of Olympus, the divine patron of the games. Before the contest could begin, before the olive wreaths could be woven, there was blood to be spilled. A great sacrifice was made at his altar, a testament of flesh and bone that reminded every man who entered the arena that victory was not theirs to claim, but his to grant. Dozens of oxen were led to the altar, their lifeblood feeding the sacred mound of ash that had grown for centuries. This was no mere gesture, it was the heart of the games, a reminder that the sweat of the athlete was not the only offering demanded by the gods. Each competitor, before he could set foot on the track, was bound by an oath sworn in the temple of Zeus. With hands resting on a piece of sacrificed bull's flesh, he swore to train with honesty, to compete with honor, to bring no shame to the games that bore the name of the King of the Sky. To break that oath was not merely to cheat another man, it was to insult the gods themselves. Those who dared to betray that trust faced more than mortal punishment. Their names were carved into the bronze statues of Zeus that flanked the stadium gates, a permanent testament to their disgrace, a warning to all who passed beneath that the gods did not forget. The guardians of this sacred trust were the Hellenodikai, the judges of the games. Chosen from the people of Elis, they were not simply officials. They were priests of the games' spirit, robed in purple and carrying staffs of authority. For 10 months before the games, they trained not just in the rules of competition, but in the rites that made every race and every throw a form of worship. They were the protectors of the ancient balance, the stewards of both sport and spirit. And presiding over it all was the Temple of Zeus, a marvel of white marble and golden light, one of the greatest wonders the ancient world ever saw. Within its columns stood the statue of Zeus, crafted by the sculptor Phidias, towering figure of ivory and gold, seated on a throne that seemed to hold the weight of the heavens. In one hand he held a scepter of kingship, in the other the figure of Nike, the goddess of victory. His calm, eternal gaze watched over every race, every cheer, every silent prayer whispered in the hush before the start. It was a gaze that said, "In this place, human and divine met in every heartbeat." Every step on that sacred ground was a dance of body and soul. Every breath was a prayer. Victory was not for personal glory alone. It was for Zeus, for the polis, for the fragile, unyielding flame of human excellence. Yet in this world of masculine striving and divine judgment, there was one truth that the dust and olive leaves could not hide. Women were almost entirely shut out. Married women were forbidden even to watch, their absence a stark line drawn in the sand of the stadium. Legend held that the penalty for disobedience was death cast from the cliffs of Mount Typeum as punishment for daring to witness what was meant for the eyes of men alone. The games were a reflection of the deeply patriarchal world that birthed them, where the sacred and the public belonged to men. But not all women were absent. The unmarried girls of Elis were sometimes allowed to watch, and there was even a counterpart to the Olympics, a festival in honor of Hera, the wife of Zeus. The Heraia was held in the same stadium, its races run by young girls whose hair flowed loose and whose tunics short, chitons left one shoulder bare to the sun. Their races were shorter, their competitions gentler, but they carried their own quiet power, a mirror of the games that burned at Olympia's heart. Yet for the men of ancient Greece, The Olympic Games were the ultimate expression of their ideal crucible in which strength, discipline, and honor were refined and revealed. In the chariot races, the thunder of hooves was more than a sound. It was a song of risk and ambition, each turn a chance to brush against the edge of eternity. The dust of the track was holy dust, each footprint an echo of those who had come before. And though only one man could wear the wreath of olive leaves, every competitor offered something to the gods, whether it was the brief flash of speed that outshone the sun, or the quiet dignity of striving in the face of certain defeat. In the end, that was the heart of Olympia, the knowledge that to strive was to honor the divine, that to test the limits of the body was to touch the edge of the soul. Victors in the ancient Olympic Games were crowned with humble olive wreaths, a circle of green cut from the sacred grove of Zeus. It was a prize of breathtaking simplicity, a symbol of the divine favor that had smiled upon them for one fleeting moment. And though it held no monetary value, it was a prize beyond price proof that they had touched something immortal. These champions were often given the right to dedicate statues to Hera at her sanctuary, a subtle acknowledgement that even in a world of masculine honor, the memory of the goddess of the home had its place. But while the Heraean Games sailed in Hera's name, for young women carried weight and tradition, they could never rival the Olympics. The Olympics were an affair of men, of muscle, sweat, and the thunder of mortal hearts striving for the favor of gods. Strength, endurance, and glory, these were the virtues cultivated in Olympia, and they were not for the sake of sport alone. They were forged for war as much as for the arena. To be a victor at Olympia was to be more than an athlete. It was to be a warrior of the polis, a living testament to the city's worth. Greek women, no matter how skilled or determined, were excluded from this sacred dance. They were not simply denied out of prejudice. It was custom and religious law intertwined, an echo of the Greek world's deep-rooted patriarchal code. Yet even in this exclusion, there was one curious crack in the marble wall of tradition: the story of Callista of Sparta. She was a woman of wealth and ambition, and she bred horses of legendary speed. Because the chariot race awarded the olive wreath not to the driver but to the owner, Callista became, in name alone, the first female Olympic victor. But tradition held firm. She never stepped foot in the stadium to watch her horses race. Her name was inscribed in the rolls of champions, but her victory was seen through the eyes of others, a triumph claimed from a distance. This division was more than a social slight. It was a reflection of how the Greeks saw the world, how they believed the divine order itself was woven. The games at Olympia were for men because they were meant to prepare the body for war and the soul for glory. They were a stage on which the strength of a city-state was played out in every sprint and throw, every contest of skill and will. For those who returned home crowned in olive leaves, the welcome was nothing short of a hero's return. City gates swung open, and the air rang with songs of triumph. Crowds pressed close to catch a glimpse of the man who had stood in the sacred dust of Olympia and emerged as more than mortal. His name might be carved in stone, etched into the city's memory. Poets like Pindar, masters of the spoken word, would craft verses of praise that wound the champion's name around the mythic deeds of the gods themselves. But the celebration was more than just noise and poetry. Victors were showered with gifts, land, money, privileges that could reshape the course of a life. In some cities, an Olympic victor was granted a lifetime of free meals at public expense, the front row seat at every theater and every gathering of the city's council. Some were even lifted into political office, their voices in civic matters made weightier because of what their bodies had proven in Olympia. For the wealthy, the games were not just about personal glory. They were a stage upon which to build a legacy. They funded training programs, sponsored promising athletes, bred and owned the horses that thundered around the hippodrome. A victory at Olympia was more than a prize, it was a claim to power, a chance to show that your house, your lineage, was favored by the gods. For the Greek aristocrat, it was like winning an election without casting a single vote. Rivalries that played out on the battlefield were mirrored in the dust of Olympia. When Athens and Sparta clashed with swords and shields, they also watched each other in the stadium. Every victor was a message. We are stronger, faster, closer to the divine. Every defeat was a wound that echoed beyond the track. The olive wreath may have been a simple thing, but in the world of ancient Greece, it was woven with the weight of nations. It was a crown of leaves, but it carried the hopes and pride of entire cities, the dreams of families, and the ambitions of rulers. For more than 1,000 years, the Olympic Games burned bright in the Greek world. Every 4 years, the call went out, and men of every city-state came together under the watchful gaze of the gods. They did not come for wealth. There was none to be gained in Olympia's sacred dust. They came for glory. They came for devotion. They came because in that brief truce of the Echecheria, when the weapons were laid aside and the olive trees whispered of peace, they could touch something eternal. But even the greatest flames can be snuffed out. In 393 CE, the Roman Emperor Theodosius I issued a decree that silenced the stadium forever. To him, the games were a relic of pagan worship, a ritual of blood and sweat that had no place in a world ruled by the cross. Temples were closed, altars dismantled, statues defaced by the hammer and the chisel of those who believed that the old gods must be buried with the past. The sacred flame of Zeus was extinguished, and the stadium fell silent for the first time in more than 1,000 years. The centuries that followed were unkind to Olympia. Earth and time crept over the ancient stones, and the echoes of the foot races and the cries of the victors were swallowed by the roots of trees and the hush of ruin. The names of champions were lost to all but the most patient scribes, who traced them in the flickering light of monasteries, preserving in dusty scrolls the memory of those who had once been more than mortal. Yet even as the statues crumbled and the temples turned to dust, the idea of the Olympic Games never truly died. It lived in the stories whispered around hearth fires, in the broken marble that still caught the morning light, in the quiet knowledge that once, for a few days every 4 years, the world itself had paused to watch men strive for something beyond themselves. The ancient Olympic Games might have vanished for centuries, swallowed by time and shifting empires, but the spark that lit them never truly died. In the 19th century, as archaeologists dug into the earth of Olympia, uncovering column fragments and the weathered bones of temples and training grounds, a question began to stir in the minds of dreamers and scholars alike. What if the games could return, not as a dusty relic to be studied in silence, but as a living testament to the human spirit, a stage, once more for the triumphs and trials that make us who we are? In 1896, that dream was given shape and breath. It was in Athens, the cradle of so many Western ideals, that the modern Olympic Games emerged from the shadows of history. Baron Pierre de Coubertin, a French educator and visionary, believed that sport had the power to do what diplomacy so often failed to achieve, to bring nations together, not in war, but in peaceful competition. He saw in the ancient Olympic ideal a lesson that still burned bright, that the pursuit of excellence, of arete virtue and skill perfected, was as vital in the modern world as it had ever been. De Coubertin borrowed much from the old ways. He kept the 4-year cycle, the steady beat of time that echoed through the centuries. He revived the procession of athletes, the parade of strength and color that spoke to the unity of a shared purpose. Even the flame was reborn, its light drawn from the sun in the ruins of Olympia with a parabolic mirror, just as the ancients might have kindled their sacred fires. That light, captured in a flicker of flame, travels across continents today, a symbol that the past is never as far away as it seems. From the ruined temples of Olympia, it winds its way to stadiums that echo with new cheers, passing from hand to hand in a relay that says, "We are still running, still striving, still reaching for the divine in every heartbeat." The modern games are a spectacle of global-scale broadcast to millions, shaped by sponsorships and national pride. And yet, for all the noise and the pageantry, that ancient heartbeat still pulses beneath the surface. The games remain a testament to human potential, to the belief that there is something higher than victory alone, something worth the sweat and sacrifice of a lifetime. The sacred fire was never truly extinguished. It was past one each flicker a promise that the ideals of Olympia would never be forgotten. Far from the sun-baked fields of Olympia, another tale of ambition and defiance was being etched into the annals of time. The story of the Colossus of Rhodes did not begin with marble or with the artist's hand. It began with a siege that tested the will of a city and gave birth to one of the ancient world's greatest wonders. The year was 305 BCE, and the island of Rhodes stood defiant against a tide of conquest. Its enemy was Demetrius I of Macedon, known to history as Demetrius the Besegera, name earned with sweat and steel. He arrived at the shores of Rhodes with an army that seemed to blot out the sun, tens of thousands of soldiers, a fleet of warships bristling with iron, and siege engines so massive they seemed like creations of the gods themselves. Chief among these was the Helepolis, the taker of cities, a siege tower 9 stories high, clad in iron and bristling with catapults. It was a fortress on wheels, a mountain of death that rolled inexorably toward the city walls. Rhodes, by contrast, was small, a jewel of trade and diplomacy, rich from its position between east and west, but no match in raw might for the army that now darkened its harbors. Demetrius came not just to conquer, but to punish, for Rhodes had dared to side with Egypt, Demetrius's rival in the endless dance of Hellenistic politics. The city should have fallen in a matter of days. It didn't. For nearly a year, the Rhodians held their ground. They turned the walls of their city into a living shield, adapting with a speed and cunning that turned Demetrius's strength against him. At night, they slipped out to burn siege engines. They cut supply lines with the precision of a surgeon's knife. Even the massive Helepolis, that iron mountain, was humbled by their ingenuity. Its iron plates drenched in oil and set ablaze, leaving it to smolder in the shadow of the city it could not breach. When the siege finally broke, it was Demetrius who withdrew in humiliation, leaving behind a city still standing and a reputation in tatters. The spoils of war were not plundered cities or conquered lands, but the abandoned relics of the siege itself: broken catapults, shattered towers, and thousands of pounds of iron and bronze. The Rhodians, scarred but unbroken, saw in these ruins not just the remnants of an attack, but the raw material of a new triumph. They would not melt the iron into new weapons, not this time. They would forge a monumental answer to every enemy who would ever dare to test their spirit. They chose to honor Helios, god of the sun, who they believed had watched over them as the siege ground on. Helios was no distant figure in the Rhodian imagination. He was the light on every wave in the harbor, the warmth that turned their island into a garden. He was the city's guardian, and now he would be given form. To bring this vision to life, they turned to Charis of Lindos, a sculptor whose name was already known for precision and ambition. Charis was a student of Lysippos, the man who had given Alexander the Great to the world in bronze and marble. Charis understood the power of proportion, the grace of movement captured in stillness. But what he was asked to build was more than art. It was a statement that would echo across the Aegean. From the battered remains of the siege, Charis envisioned something the world had never seen: a statue that would stand over 30 meters tall, taller than any building in the city, taller even than the masts of the ships that carried Rhodian trade to every corner of the sea. The Colossus of Rhodes would be more than a monument. It would be a declaration cast in bronze, a defiance that would stand for generations. The project began as the city healed from the siege. The metal from Demetrius's abandoned machines was melted down, poured, and hammered into shape beneath the relentless sun. Each rivet, each plate of bronze was a testament to the city's survival. Charis worked for 12 years, overseeing a workforce of craftsmen and laborers who moved like an orchestra under his command. Bit by bit, the sun god took shape, each line of his body a testament to the harmony of art and engineering. His head lifted to the heavens, his eyes cast out across the harbor. Helios became not just a figure of worship, but a promise. Rhodes stands tall, Rhodes stands free. And when the Colossus was finally complete, it was not just a statuette, it was the spirit of a city forged in the crucible of war, a reminder that even the smallest city can cast the longest shadow when it stands together. The Colossus of Rhodes was a feat of ambition and engineering so grand that even today, centuries after it fell, its legend still towers in the imagination of humankind. It rose from the battered pride of a city that refused to kneel and took the weapons of its would-be conquerors and turned them into a message cast in bronze. Rhodes stands unbroken. At its final height of over 100 feet, nearly the size of a modern 10-story building, the statue of Helios was a testament to both technical mastery and indomitable spirit. It was an achievement that seemed to stretch the limits of what mortal hands could accomplish. A statement in bronze and stone that spoke to every ship that sailed into the Rhodian harbor. Here stands a city that could not be conquered. The materials themselves carried a poetry of transformation. The bronze that became the skin of the sun god was not newly minted. It had once been the weapons of war, the siege engines and armor of Demetrius, the besiegers' failed campaign. The Rhodians took the tools of their near destruction and melted them down to forge their protector. In every shimmering plate, every inch of polished bronze, there was a silent promise: never again. The construction began around 292 BCE and stretched over 12 years, each day a testament to the patient determination of a people who believed in what they were building. The statue was raised not in a single glorious moment, but in a slow, deliberate symphony of labor. Craftsmen and workers toiled beneath the hot sun, their sweat mixing with the dust of the city's wounds. The rhythmic clang of hammer on bronze echoed through the harbor as each piece was shaped and set in place. Engineers believe the Colossus was built from the ground up, each section carefully cast, hoisted, and reinforced as the statue climbed ever higher. Perhaps they used massive earthen ramps, a temporary mountain that rose along with the figure of Helios, lifting them to the sky until the god's head could look out across the waters. Then, when the final bronze plates had been secured, and the final joints hidden within the framework of iron and stone, the ramps were cleared away, leaving only the towering sun god to greet the dawn. No ancient images survive to show us exactly how he stood, but poets and chroniclers left us hints of figure upright, youthful, and serene. Some believed he raised one hand to shield his eyes against the brilliance of his own sun, a gesture both proud and eternal. Others imagined his arm lifted in greeting, a silent benediction over the harbor and the people who called it home. His face was calm, his gaze cast eastward, across the sea that was Rhodes' lifeblood. The engineering was nothing short of miraculous. Each bronze plate was shaped with the precision of a sculptor's chisel and the strength of an iron forger's hammer. They were locked into an internal skeleton of stone and iron, a hidden framework that held the statue's impossible weight and gave it life. The Rhodians, guided by Charis of Lindos and his mastery of form and balance, understood how to distribute that weight, how to keep the bronze giant from toppling in the island winds. When the last bronze plate was set in place, the Colossus was more than a statue. It was a statement, a sentinel, a promise cast in the warm light of the Aegean sun. The myths that later claimed it straddled the harbor, legs apart as ships sailed beneath it, are likely no more than the dreams of poets and storytellers. Practical minds and modern scholars know that such a pose would have been impossible, the weight too great and the strain too fatal. Instead, the Colossus stood watch from the edge of the harbor, perhaps atop a stone pedestal, where the first rays of dawn would gild its crown of sunbeams. For the Rhodians, this was more than an idol. In Helios, they had cast their defiance and their gratitude. They had turned the relics of war into a monument of peace and pride. Every merchant who entered the harbor, every diplomat who stepped ashore, saw not just a statue, but a city that had survived the siege and had turned its scars into something magnificent. Visitors stood in awe beneath Helios's bronze gaze. They saw not just the gleaming plates that caught the morning light like the first breath of dawn, but the spirit of a people who had refused to break. The Colossus was their pride, their protector, and their message to the world. This is Rhodes, and it stands tall. For 12 years, the Colossus was more than an ornamented, was the heartbeat of the city. In the dusty streets and bustling markets, in the quiet prayers of fishermen at dawn and the songs of merchants at dusk, Helios was ever present, his shadow a reminder of what the city had endured and what it could still become. The harbor itself took on new life. Traders from across the Mediterranean came not just for the goods of Rhodes, but to see the wonder of Helios. Gold and silks from the east, amphorae of wine and oil from the Greek mainland, spices and stories from lands so distant they seemed to shimmer like myths, flowed through Rhodes like the tide, all under the watchful eyes of their sunlit god. And in every deal struck, in every promise made beneath the gaze of the bronze colossus, there was the quiet understanding that Rhodes was more than just another city on the sea. It was a Bicona place where human hands had turned ruin into triumph, and where the divine and the mortal met in the glint of hammered bronze. But even the greatest triumphs are not eternal. The Colossus of Rhodes did more than cast a shadow across the harbor, it cast a light across the very soul of the city. For the Rhodians, the statue was not just a marvel of bronze, and ironic was proof that they were more than survivors. In the face of siege and ruin, they had sculpted something beautiful from the remnants of their enemies' rage. The Colossus was a statement, a monument to resilience, a shining beacon to anyone who set foot on that storied island. With Helios standing tall over the waves, Rhodes became a cultural epicenter. Its markets thrummed with the commerce of the world, the laughter of sailors mingling with the debates of philosophers. Statues of gods and heroes lined the agora, and orators' voices rang out like music. Schools of rhetoric blossomed, where minds as sharp as swords learned to shape words like weapons. The city's wealth was measured not only in silver and goods, but in ideas in the bright coin of learning and artistry that passed from mind to mind. And wherever those minds traveled, they carried with them the image of the Colossus, its radiating crown stamped onto coins, its likeness graven into the memory of every merchant and diplomat who crossed its gaze. The coins of Rhodes traveled far and wide, carried in the holds of ships that plied the wine-dark seas. Each piece of currency was a talisman, a promise that Rhodes was a place where the divine touched the mortal, where strength was not just measured in armies but in vision. In time, the Colossus became more than just a protector of the city. It was a symbol of a universal truth, that from the ashes of war, something glorious could rise. To see the Colossus at dawn, when the first rays of sun painted its bronze skin with molten light, was to see hope itself cast in metal. It was a declaration that the human spirit could turn even defeat into something transcendent. Visitors from across the Mediterranean marveled at the harmony of art and faith that the Colossus embodied. For some, it was a symbol of divine favor, proof that Helios had smiled upon the people of Rhodes and blessed them with his light. For others, it was a testament to mortal skill and ambition, a song of victory that sang in bronze and echoed across the sea. And for the Rhodians, it was theirs wholly, unshakably theirs, their triumph, their sun, their promise to the world that no matter how dark the night, the light would return. But even the strongest light can flicker. In 226 BCE, just over a generation after the Colossus was completed, the earth beneath Rhodes began to tremble. Without warning, a massive earthquake struck the island, shaking the city's walls and shattering its quiet dawn. Homes crumbled, temples cracked. The proud harbor walls, which had once defied the machines of Demetrius, buckled under nature's hand. And with a groan of tortured metal and a sound that some said was like the cry of a god, the Colossus fell. It did not topple like a tree in the forest. It broke apart, piece by piece, twisting as it fell. First, the legs buckled, the iron skeleton groaning under the sudden violence of the quake. The upper body pitched forward, and with a crash like thunder, it slammed into the earth. Fingers the size of men's torsos snapped and scattered. The radiant crown of Helios shattered, and the face that had gazed across the sea lay buried in dust. No one in Rhodes had expected it. No one could have stopped it. The statue that had stood as a guardian for a decade and more was gone in an instanta casualty, not of war, but of the quiet, merciless power of the earth itself. For the people of Rhodes, the loss was more than the ruin of a wonder. It was the loss of a companion, a symbol that had stood with them through every storm and every sunrise. The fallen Colossus lay sprawled across the sacred ground, a ruin of bronze limbs and broken iron ribs. Yet even in ruin, it was magnificent. Travelers continued to come. The historian Strabo wrote of the fallen giant centuries later, describing how visitors stood awestruck among the shattered remains. They ran their hands along the fingers thicker than a man's body, traced the ribs of bronze that curled like the bones of some ancient god. They saw not just the ruin, but the testament to what human hands could build when they dared to reach for the sun. For some, the earthquake was a punishment from the gods, proof that hubris would always be answered with a fall. For others, it was a reminder that even the greatest glories were as fleeting as a wave on the sea. But for the Rhodians themselves, the fallen Colossus was still sacred. They did not cart away the broken bronze. They did not try to erase the memory of its fall. Instead, they left the pieces where they lay, a silent, rusting hymn to the memory of what had been. For the next 800 years, the shattered Colossus remained, a relic and a monument all at once. In its brokenness, it became almost more human than it had been in its perfection. The upright god of sun and triumph was gone, but in his place was something that spoke of impermanence, of the fragile beauty of all mortal endeavors. Long after the quake's dust had settled, when the songs of grief had faded into the background hum of daily life, the question still rose like mist over the harbor. Should we rebuild it? The people of Rhodes stood among the bronze shards, the twisted iron bones, and debated. Some said the Colossus should rise again, that the sun god's light must not be dimmed by the whim of the earth. Others argued that it was enough to remember what had been, that to build anew was to risk the anger of the gods who had let it fall. In the end, the pieces remained. The sun rose each day, its light glinting off the greened bronze of the fallen Helios. Fishermen cast their nets in the shadow of the broken crown, and children played among the quiet wreckage, their laughter a gentle echo of the triumph that had once been cast in iron and bronze. The Colossus of Rhodes was never rebuilt, but in its ruin, it endured not just as a memory, but as a lesson. Strength can be shattered, glory can be silenced, but the human spirit, which dared to raise a god of bronze to the sky, remains unbroken. In every sunlit wave that kissed the shores of Rhodes, in every coin that still bore the sun's radiant crown, that spirit whispered, "Even the greatest fall, but we rise again." The Colossus of Rhodes, even as it lay broken upon the earth, became something more than bronze and iron. It became a mirror reflection of how glory can be both fleeting and eternal. As its pieces weathered the sun and the salt-scented winds, the people of Rhodes looked upon them not with shame, but with a reverence that deepened year by year. What had once been a testament to triumph now stood as a testament to survival, a promise that though stone and metal may fall, the spirit of a city does not. Among the twisting alleys and whitewashed courtyards of Rhodes, the question of whether to rebuild the Colossus was never truly put to rest. Some argued that to raise Helios again would be to defy the will of the godsa show of mortal arrogance that might bring down even greater calamities. Others longed to see the sun god restored, to see his bronze face glint in the dawn light once more. But in a city that had survived the siege of Demetrius, that had watched its greatest wonder crumble in an instant, there was a caution born of hard-won wisdom. When the Rhodians turned to the oracle of Delphi for guidance, her answer chilled the city to its bones. She spoke in riddles and shadows, as oracles always did, but her meaning was clear. The fall of the Colossus was no accident. It was a sign. Helios was displeased, and to challenge that divine judgment by rebuilding the statue would be to invite further wrath. The Rhodians, devout and wary of the caprice of their sun god, took the warning to heart. There were, of course, more practical considerations. The original Colossus had been a marvel of its age, born from the spoils of war and the generosity of allies who had seen in Rhodes a beacon of defiance. To build it again would require resources that no longer flowed so freely, wealth that was needed for the ships that kept Rhodes alive, for the walls that guarded it against a world forever shifting and restless. The political landscape of the Aegean was more volatile than ever, alliances as fluid as the waves that lapped at the harbor. In such times, the grandeur of a statue seemed a distant second to the security of the city itself. And so the decision was made: let the Colossus lie. Let its fallen limbs and broken crown rest as they had fallen, a testament to both human ambition and divine will. The pieces became more than relics, they became a pilgrimage. Pilgrims and poets came from across the Mediterranean to see the shattered god of Rhodes. They walked among the massive bronze ribs, tracing with their fingers the lines of a wonder that had once reached for the sky. They pressed their palms to the outstretched fingers of Helios, feeling in the cold metal the echo of an ancient heartbeat. For the Rhodians, the broken Colossus was not a source of shame. It was a reminder, a lesson in the impermanence of even the greatest dreams. In its silence, it spoke of humility, of the fragility of all things wrought by human hands. It became part of the city's soul, as much a wonder in ruin as it had ever been in its towering glory. In the centuries that followed, the Colossus became more famous in ruin than it had ever been in life. The Greek historian Strabo wrote of its remains with a kind of hushed awe, describing how the shattered limbs still dwarfed those who came to stand among them. The bronze fingers were thicker than a man's torso, the hollow limbs as tall as towers. Even broken, the Colossus was a marvel proof that human hands could touch the heavens, even if only for a moment. Unlike other wonders of the ancient world temples burned by invaders, statues toppled in Warth Colossus was claimed not by human violence, but by the quiet, indifferent power of the earth itself. The earthquake that brought it down was a reminder that nature, in its slow and silent might, answers to no mortal king or god. And so the remains of the Colossus were treated with reverence, not as a failure, but as a testament to the mortal desire to build something beautiful, even in the face of inevitable collapse. Rhodes became a destination for those who sought the wonder of the world, even in its broken state. Alongside the lighthouse of Alexandria and the hanging gardens of Babylon, the shattered Colossus stood in memory as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Travelers came to see not just the might of its construction, but the quiet dignity of its ruin. Where other wonders dazzled with their grandeur, the fallen Colossus whispered of something deeper, the beauty of impermanence, the poetry of ruin. To stand among the broken pieces was to confront the truth that all things pass. The sun god had fallen, but in his brokenness, he became more than a statue, became a symbol of the human spirit's refusal to be undone by fate. Visitors would pause in the quiet dawn light, imagining how Helios had once lifted his gaze across the harbor, radiant and eternal. In the mind's eye, the Colossus still stood, taller and prouder than any conqueror's dream. For over 8 centuries, the bronze fragments lay where they fell, a sleeping giant of memory and myth. The people of Rhodes walked past them each day, children growing up in the shadow of what had once been, old men remembering the sun god's gaze on their youth. And still the visitors, camera merchants from Carthage, poets from Athens, Roman nobles chasing the echoes of Greece's ancient glory. They stood among the ruins and saw not just the fall of a statue, but the endurance of a city. Then, in the year 654 CE, the quiet dominion of memory was shattered once more. The Umayyad Caliphate, a new power rising from the sands of Arabia, turned its gaze upon Rhodes. The city fell, its defenders overwhelmed by the tide of conquest. With the conquerors came a new creed and a new vision of the world done that saw the bronze fragments of Helios not as a wonder to be cherished, but as a prize to be claimed. According to later Byzantine chroniclers, the conquerors saw in the wreckage of the Colossus an opportunity. The bronze was not sacred to them. It was a resource, wealth to be carried away and repurposed. The ancient statue that had watched over the harbor for century 7 in ruin was no longer a symbol of divine favor. It was a treasure to be melted down, recast in the furnaces of another empire. The final act of the Colossus was not one of glory, but of quiet surrender. The conquerors dismantled what remained, piece by piece, until even the memory of Helios was carried away in the holds of ships bound for distant foundries. The last of the sun, God's bronze limbs vanished into the melting heat of the forge, and with them, the final echoes of a wonder that had once stood among the greatest of the ancient world. Yet in the hearts of those who had seen it, in the words of poets who had walked among its ruin, the Colossus never truly died. In the whispered tales of travelers, in the hush of dawn over roads, the memory of Helios still shines. Because even in its fall, the Colossus taught a lesson that no conqueror could erase, that the light we cast in the world, whether in stone or in spirit, endures, long after the metal has melted away. The Colossus of Rhodes was no more. Its bronze skin and iron bones melted down and carried away piece by piece. They say it took 900 camels to bear the weight of a fallen god, a caravan of shadows that snaked through the desert sands and out of the memory of the island it had once watched over. Whether that number was fact or fable, it was a symbolic reminder that even the greatest wonders can be reduced to cargo and commerce. The Syrian merchant who carted away the remains would have seen not the spirit of Helios, but the gleam of wealth. In the crackling fires of distant forges, the sun god's bronze body was melted and reshaped, turned to new tools, new ornaments, new ambitions far removed from the ideals that had once given it shape. Rhodes, stripped of its guardian's bronze gaze, was left with only the memory of what had once stood, taller than kings and dreams alike. Yet for the world beyond Rhodes, the Colossus was not truly gone. The stories it left behind were more durable than any metal. Writers of every age, chroniclers, poets, and philosophers, kept its image alive. They placed it among the wonders of the world, shoulder to shoulder with the pyramids of Egypt and the lighthouse of Alexandria, as if its spirit still stretched skyward, even as its body lay scattered and cold. The Colossus became a legend not despite its destruction, but because of it. The echo of its fall resounded through the centuries, transforming it from a statue of bronze into a symbol of human ambition, both the hubris that can bring us low and the wonder that can lift us up. Medieval mapmakers, their quills dancing over parchment, drew it straddling the harbor entrance like a living gate of bronze, even though no engineer in Rhodes had ever dared such a feat. Renaissance painters gave it the stance of a titan, legs braced against the earth, a colossus not just in name but in stature, casting shadows over oceans and empires alike. The irony was that the real Colossus left behind so few clues. No blueprints survived the centuries, no faithful copies in miniature, no sketch by an ancient hand to tell us exactly how he stood or what he saw. Everything we know, everything we imagine, comes from the words of travelers who walked in his shadow, and from the imaginations of those who came too late to see him at all. And yet perhaps it is this very absence that makes the Colossus eternal, because it was never only a statue. It was a dream forged in metallivision of what mortals can build when courage, beauty, and purpose come together. A declaration that a city no bigger than a shadow on the map could stand defiant before the empires that would swallow it whole. Even in ruins, the Colossus taught the world something that could not be melted down. Its image was no longer just the face of Helios, was the face of every city and every soul that has ever risen from the ashes of defeat to build something new. In every torch lifted in the night, in every monument that stands at the edge of a harbor or the heart of a square, there is an echo of the Colossus of Rhodes. It was a lesson that crossed the centuries and found new form in new lands. When France gifted the Statue of Liberty to the United States, they weren't just sending bronze and copper across the Atlantic, they were sending a memory. They were sending a promise that a towering figure by the water's edge could be more than a guardian. It could be a symbol of hope, of welcome, of the shared dream that binds strangers together. In modern times, whispers of rebuilding the Colossus have surfaced like dreams that refuse to die. Engineers and artists have imagined a new Helios rising from the harborsome envisioned solar panels woven into his bronze skin. A sun god reborn in light and sustainability, his rays now feeding the energy of the future. Others dream of a monument of glass and steel, a ghost of the ancient wonder hovering above the waves. None of these visions have yet come to pass, but their very existence is a testament to the power of what was once wrought in the heat of the forge and the fire of human ambition. Because the Colossus was never just about bronze or iron. It was about the message that even when we are broken, we can rise again. It was about the idea that out of the devastation of war, something radiant can still be born. It was about the defiance of a people who took the weapons of their enemies and shaped them into a sun that would never set. The Rhodians understood something that resonates still. That sometimes the greatest monuments are not those that stand unbroken, but those that teach us how to endure. The Colossus, even in pieces, was a lesson in resilience. It showed that beauty can emerge from the forge of suffering, that hope can be found in the echo of the hammer on bronze, in the patient hands that shape metal into meaning. In every empire that has risen and fallen since, in every city that has rebuilt itself from the ashes of conquest or the tremors of nature, there is a piece of the Colossus. In every arch that spans a river, in every statue that greets the sun at dawn, there is an echo of Helios's broken gaze, still watching, still shining. The Colossus of Rhodes is gone, its pieces long since melted and scattered to the winds. But its shadow still stretches across time, a reminder that the monuments we build are not just for the eyes of those who stand before them. They are for the hearts of those who come after, who look up at what we have left and see not just what was, but what could be. Of those who remember, a god of bronze still watches the waves. Though his body is gone and his limbs scattered to the winds of time, the memory of Helios and Durazza's presence felt more in spirit than in form. It is said that in the hush of dawn, when the first golden light shimmers across the harbor of Rhodes, you can almost hear the quiet echo of his watchful gaze, a silent vow of guardianship that still lingers in the breath of the sea breeze. Even broken, the Colossus of Rhodes never truly fell. In the minds of those who have stood in that ancient harbor, merchants who once traced trade routes across the world, poets who found music in the bronze clang of history, sailors who steered their ships beneath the phantom shadow of the sun god, he lives on. His silhouette is woven into the songs of the Aegean, his legend etched in the stories we tell about resilience, about what it means to rise and to fall, and to still cast light into the future. The Colossus was never just an idol of metal. He was the embodiment of a city's defiance. When Demetrius the Besieger arrived at the gates of Rhodes with his siege towers and his vast army, he expected submission. He found instead a city that would not yield, that turned the weight of war into the forge of glory. In the ruins of those broken war machines, the people of Rhodes saw the seeds of something greater, something that would outlast any conqueror's pride. The Colossus was born from that Vajona declaration that the spoils of war can be melted and remade into a testament to peace and strength. The sun god's gaze, once cast across the blue horizon, became a symbol not only for Rhodes, but for every soul who has ever faced the weight of defeat and chosen instead to build. Helios stood for more than a city. He stood for the belief that from the ashes of ruin, something luminous can rise. And in that belief, he found immortality. The hands of artisans who shaped him worked not just with bronze and iron, but with dreams. The engineers who balanced his impossible weight understood they were building more than a statue. They were building a message to every ship that sailed into that harbor. Here stands Rhodes, unbroken. Here stands the light of human ambition, radiant and defiant. And so they labored for 12 long years, each hammer stroke echoing like a heartbeat across the waves. Even when the earthquake Camia, tremor of the earth, so sudden and cruel that it split the world in two, Helios did not vanish from the memory of men. His fall was as powerful as his rise, a reminder that no monument, no matter how grand, can stand forever. Yet the beauty of the Colossus was never in its permanence. It was in its creation, in the spirit, that refused to let the tools of war remain tools of death. In turning weapons into wonder, the Rhodians taught us that the measure of greatness is not in how long a statue endures, but in how deeply it inspires. For centuries after the quake, the ruins of the Colossus lay as a testament to that lesson. Pilgrims and wanderers came not to see a flawless god of bronze, but to stand in the shadow of his broken limbs, and to remember that even the mightiest can fall. They ran their hands along fingers thicker than a man's thigh, stared into the hollow eyes of a shattered head, and in those fragments found a new kind of majestion that whispered of human frailty and human hope. The brokenness of the Colossus became part of its power. Other wonders of the ancient world were torn down in conquest, shattered in the fury of empires. But Helios fell to the earth, not to an army's rage, but to the quiet, indifferent force of nature. There was no shame in that fall, only the reminder that all things made by human hands must eventually bow to the breath of the world itself. Even as the pieces of the statue lay scattered, they became a kind of monument in themselves. In Rhodes, the people did not sweep them away or melt them down for lesser uses. They let them rest, silent and grand in their ruin, a kind of open-air cathedral to the memory of what had been. In that choice, they showed the world that there is dignity in remembrance, that sometimes the echo of what was is more profound than the reality of what is. Centuries passed, empires rose and fell, the world turned, and still the story of the Colossus refused to die. In the medieval maps of Europe, he loomed larger than life, legs astride the harbor in an impossible stance that no engineer in Rhodes had ever dared. Renaissance painters gave him the form of a giant, a sun-crowned titan who might have stepped from myth to stand watch over oceans and dreams. The real Helios never stood so, but the idea of him did. And in that idea, he became a colossus indeed, not of metal, but of imagination. When the conquerors of Rhodes finally came in the 7th century, they found not a statue, but the memory of a city that had dared to reach for the sky. The bronze was carried away, melted and reforged into new shapes in distant lands, but the spirit of the Colossus remained. It was in the memory of those who had stood in his shadow, in the stories passed down by poets, and the quiet pride of the islanders who still looked to the sun each dawn and remembered. In every age, echoes of the Colossus have stirred anew. When France raised the Statue of Liberty in the harbor of New York, it was more than a gesture of friendship. It was an echo of Rhodes, a towering figure by the sea, a promise cast in metal that light will always return. And in modern dreams, the thought of rebuilding the Colossus still flickers like a distant star. Solar panels to honor the sun god, glass towers that shimmer like the morning light visions that may never be realized, but that speak of the human spirit's refusal to let go of the hope that something grand can always rise from the dust. Because that is the true legacy of the Colossus of Rhodes, not the height of the statue, nor the weight of its bronze, but the light it still casts in the mind of every dreamer, in the belief that from the weapons of war we can forge wonders, that from the ruins of what falls, something new can be born, that even broken, even lost, a guardian of bronze can still watch the waves. The Colossus no longer stands in the harbor of Rhodes, but it stands wherever we dare to build, wherever we choose to see strength and beauty, wherever we remember that the greatest monuments are not always those that endure in stone, but those that endure in the stories we tell and the dreams we dare to follow.